Okay, so I really just want to open up with a few quotes. I'm one of those people that is science. I think of myself as sort of scientist meets poet meets garden gnome or something like that. But I really appreciate not just the science that we're about to talk about, but also the heart-centered nature of gardening. And so I just have a few quotes for you, especially inspiring in this time, because I know some of you are here to learn how to grow vegetables, and some of you are here to learn how to just be with what is in this moment of what we're all experiencing, and gardening is a great way to do that. So this is one of my favorite quotes: "The glory of gardening, hands in the dirt, head in the sun, heart with nature. To nurture a garden is to feed not just the body, but the soul." And I hope that you will all experience that through your new adventures in gardening. And this is particularly relevant today when the world wearies and society fails to satisfy. There is always the garden. And that really is my MO in life. When things get hard, I pretty much always go to the garden. And the great news is it works 99% of the time. So really excited to invite you into all that. And this is one of my favorite things. I have a sign in my house that says gardening is like therapy, and you get tomatoes. So I think hopefully you'll find a little bit of therapy and a whole lot of veggies coming out of all of this. Okay, so here's just our quick agenda for the day. We're going to be going through 9 topics: site selection, so how you choose where your garden goes, how to make beds, how to create a planting plan, how to map your garden, whether you should be using seeds or transplants in your garden. Then watering is a big one, plant nutrition, weeding, and then how to deal with pests. So we're going to do all that somehow in the next just a little bit under 2 hours. Also, I wanted to acknowledge some things said that this class was from 10 to 12, and some said 10 to 12:30. And I'm going to say the answer is yes. It will either be till 12 or 12:30. I'm hoping that we can be done by 12, but probably if there are a lot of questions with this many people, it may continue on. And if you need to go, like I said, it'll be recorded, so you won't miss anything.
And the other note I want to say about all those subjects, so today, because it's a 2-hour class, we're going to be running through those pretty quickly, but we also will continue to offer more classes. So if you want to dive down deep into any one of those things, chances are we'll have a class that's, a whole 2-hour class just on one of those 9 subjects.
That's exact. Thank you so much for saying that, Mila. That is true. There are a lot more classes coming. So let's get started. So planning your garden. These are the things we're going to go through. We're going to talk about how to choose your site, making garden beds, when to start seeds, and how to make a planting plan. Okay, so choosing, this is pretty funny. It looks like the S got cut off of my slide. So it says, think unlight. No, think lots of light. Think sunlight, it should say. So when you're choosing your garden, just remember these plants, almost all plants in your garden are going to require quite a bit of sunlight. So you're looking for the area in your yard that has the maximum amount of sunlight. Also, we want you to get to know your soil. So don't be afraid to go out there and dig some holes and feel your soil. You're going to start to recognize what good soil looks like. Good soil is dark in color in general. It has chunks of organic matter in it. So you'll see bits of either rotted branches or leaves or things like that. Things you'll recognize as formerly having been alive is what we are talking about when we're saying organic matter. So you want to have good soil, good sunlight. Another thing that's really important, and this is from a pest and disease perspective, is you need good airflow. So if you have a site that's your house is blocking the movement of air, for example, that may be an area where we're going to find a lot more humidity and a lot less ability for the air to push, for example, fungal spores that are landing on your plants to push them away. So airflow is critical. Also, don't underestimate the importance of convenience. For those of you who have maybe planted a garden before and it was not in an ideal spot that you maybe walked past all the time, neglect of your garden, human neglect of the garden is probably the #1 reason that gardens fail. So don't be afraid to be thinking about convenience when you are choosing your garden site. And then avoiding problem spots, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. So gardens need sunlight. I mean, this kind of goes without saying, but I can't tell you how often I visit people's gardens and they are in the shade. So if you're growing vegetables specifically, most of our vegetables are going to require a minimum of 6 hours of full sun. So that means that they're in an area where the sun is shining completely, no shadow, for at least 6 hours a day. And a fun way to figure that out, to just go outside and explore. And so one of the first things we're doing when we're finding our site is to just take a day or two to just observe your site and see what's going on there, and spend some time outside walking around at different times of day. So look at where your sun is coming from. Is your full sun in the morning, or is it in the afternoon? Morning sun can be really nice for some of our crops that are a little more cool weather crops. We'll talk about those later, because in the morning, of course, when the sun first comes up, it's colder out than when it is in the afternoon. So morning sun is cooler than afternoon sun. But most of the crops that we're going to be talking about growing in a garden really want afternoon sun. A southern exposure is extra special bonus. That's your most likely way that you're going to get a lot less shade in your garden. And also having a gradual slope is really helpful for getting adequate sunlight. So how much sun does your garden get? Here's a little list, and remember, you'll be getting a PDF of this later. These are the crops that have to have at least 6 hours of sun a day. And what you'll recognize, for example, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, those first ones, those are tropical plants. Those are plants that evolved in the subtropical region of our world. They are just barely hanging on here in the northern hemisphere. So we need to give them hot, hot sun. And then some other things are a little more adapted to our area, but they really, really prefer full sun. If anyone here has ever tried to grow melons in upstate New York, you'll know you're going to need the hottest spot to get a melon that's anything sizable. So really, really noticing what's full sun. And what I want to tell you is that as you garden, as you do this year after year, this information will be something you don't need to look up anymore. You will just start to remember which are the cold season crops and which are the warm season crops, which crops can have full sun and which don't need full sun. And so don't be intimidated if you're like, I can never memorize that list. Well, you will, as you get to know the plants, these things will come to you. Okay, so there are some plants that can do okay without full sun. So maybe you're here and you're like, oh my gosh, Jenny, you know what? I don't have full sun. Like, can I not garden? You can still garden, but you're just gonna have a little shorter list to choose from. So for 2 to 6 hours of sun is what we generally call partial sun, and you can still be growing all the greens, cooking greens, salad greens. Peas will tolerate partial sun. Anything that's a vine, I'll take that back because tomatoes are vines and they really won't tolerate partial sun. But vines have generally evolved to grow on trees, so they've evolved to grow in the shade. So peas can actually handle a tiny bit of shade. You'll get fewer peas, but you will still get peas. Beets and carrots, root crops that can handle a little bit less sun than some of the other things. And so you still have some choices there. And let's say you have a totally shady spot. Can you still grow anything? The great news is we have a couple of species from our garden that have evolved from understory plants that have grown in forests. These are salad greens, cooking greens, lettuces, and spinach. And you can still do quite a lot with those greens and have a wonderfully nutritious diet with almost no sun. Okay, so let's talk about your soil for a minute, because every good gardener knows that really it's the soil that's doing all the work. We just put the seeds in the ground, put the plants in the ground, but without good soil, you really don't have a garden. So a couple of little things, we have entire semester-long courses in soil science, so we're gonna do the 2-slide version of that. But here's the basics that you need to know. You need your soil to drain well. So water, standing water, is a breeding ground for bacteria and fungi and other things that like to eat your plants when you'd rather be eating them. And so another thing is you're going to be looking for signs of organic matter. Like I said before, anything that used to be alive and is no longer alive in your soil, this is organic matter. Organic matter is critically important because the microbes and the fungi that live in the soil that really help your plants to be able to accumulate the right nutrients, those guys eat organic matter. And so they need the organic matter in order to be able to produce the things that are helping your plants get proper nutrition. If you live in an urban area, one thing you also want to do is check for lead. A lot of our soils have lead in them, either from manufacturing or from the use of unleaded gas or leaded gas back in the day. So if you do have an urban garden, you will want to check for lead. Or if you're not checking for lead, then you want to use raised beds and bring in new soil. So a lot of you that live in Ithaca, if you're in the Fall Creek area, you'll notice when you walk around Fall Creek, you see a lot of raised beds, and that's because there is lead in the soil, and most of Fall Creek and some other areas in Tompkins County. And also, it's a really fun thing you can do is to have a soil test done. So if you want to know the pH of your soil, we can test that for you here at CCE Tompkins. Of course, we can't test it for you right now until the coronavirus quarantine is over. But you can also take your soil to have a test done at various soil testing facilities all around New York State. And those folks are still testing soil. If you go to our website, you'll see instructions on how to do that, and we can send that around for you as well. No standing water. So if you see standing water in your garden, that's a really good sign you have poor drainage, especially if you happen to see it at a time when it hasn't been raining a lot frequently. Also, people sometimes see an area and they see weeds and they think, oh, this area is too weedy. Well, guess what? Weeds are actually a really good sign that you found a good place to garden. And that's because we already know that plants can grow really well there. So if you find a spot that's particularly weedy, that can be productive. Now you may, if you choose a really weedy spot, need to do some things in order to make that spot a lot less weedy, and you may be battling weeds for a good little while, but you also know that you probably have really productive soil. Now, the great news is even if all of these things, you'll go out there and you're like, Jen, I've got standing water, I have no drainage, I have lead, and nothing seems good. The great news is you still have something you can do. So when conditions aren't good, like Mila is a great example. Mila has a beautiful house in a beautiful place, and she has awful soil. And so when
It's the worst.
Yeah, it's the worst.
It's doesn't drain well. There's standing water. Like right now, if I dig, I get a puddle underneath there. So what I did is I just built up. I picked the spots that are the least terrible, and I've just been building my soil year after year, and Jenny's going to get into some really awesome ways to build your soil up in a minute.
Yep, so we're going to talk about how you can build up. Okay, so we're talking about choosing our garden site still. Location, location, location is everything. And the biggest things I want you to be thinking about after you think about that sun and the soil are the good airflow, so to keep diseases away. And then also convenience, because out of sight, out of mind is a real thing when it comes to the garden, even for those of us that are extraordinarily passionate about gardening. The spots in our yard that are harder to get to are the ones that get neglected. And also a thing you want to be thinking about is access to water. So if you've ever had a garden in an area where maybe you couldn't reach your hose to, or you had to walk really far to the watering can, I think you probably have had a lot of wilty plants in the past. And so we're just really thinking about access to water.
And I'm going to say this, don't be afraid to garden in your front yard. Most of my veggie gardening happens right in my front yard, right, where everyone in the road can see. We've had this long tradition of trying to keep the vegetables in the back because there's something not aesthetic about them. But really, it's all in the eye of the beholder. And the more we normalize the fact that we're growing our vegetables in our own home, the more having vegetables in the front makes sense. Sometimes that's your best spot. So don't worry about what the neighbors think, but we're going to give you some tips to help you with what the neighbors think.
Okay, so you're going to see this slide that you see right now. Pause for questions every little once in a while. That's so I don't forget about you. Sometimes I get talking. So when you see these gorgeous cabbages, this is an opportunity to click the raise your hand button, and Mila's going to be monitoring that. She will call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Great. So, well, first I'm going to go through the questions that are in the chat box.
Great.
So what we have is, are any of the soil tests you can buy online any good in a pinch until we can take our soil sample to CCE?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that there are some that are, for the pH kits, there are some that will work well for soil pH. Also, I would say that there are some kits that don't work as well. So it really depends on the kit. I will also invite you to all note down the email address for our Grow Line. We have a wonderful hotline here called the Grow Line that is staffed by our master gardeners, and they are continuing to do an amazing job of answering all the Grow Line questions remotely. So if you want, for example, a recommendation for a home soil test that you can do, you can email the following email address, and I have it listed later in the presentation. It's growline, all lowercase, GROWLINE, and then the number 1 @gmail.com. And they will answer just about any gardening question you have. Now, if you're from another county outside of Tompkins, I would invite you to just go to the the webpage for your county's cooperative extension, your county also probably has a grow line, and you can email them. They'll be able to give you information that's really specific to your county. So I know even though we can't take soil samples right now, Agro One, which is the local soil testing company, they are still accepting soil samples, and you can visit their website and find out how to do that. Okay,
We'll have links to all this in the follow-up materials. So the next question we have is, how do you check for lead?
Great question. So that would be a soil test from Agro One, and they have a specific lead test for you.
And is good airflow the same as good drainage?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So when we talk about good drainage, generally we're talking about water. So that would have to do with your soil. Whereas good airflow, we're really talking about the movement of wind and air through the soil. So in some ways it is drainage. It's just air drainage.
Okay. And then let's see, what about sandy soil?
Oh, sandy soil. Okay. So sandy soil is, I would say sandy soil is the hardest to garden in. However, it's also the one where you're the least likely to end up with diseases. So with sandy soil, the challenge we have is that it drains too quickly. So we have really big particle sizes. So the best thing to do when you have sandy soil is to add a ton of compost. You want to keep adding organic matter to your soil until what you have has a lot more small pore sizes in there. And what you'll find is with every gardener out there is going to find the crops that grow well and the crops that don't grow as well. Sandy soil is great for root crops, and it might have a little bit more difficulty with crops that grow really big and tall because you don't have that stability for your roots. And so just feeling that texture and seeing if you can get some of that sticky stuff in there from compost, from organic matter. I would be even thinking about possibly, if I had really sandy soil, probably building up and bringing in some soil.
We've got a deer question. I think we're going to hold that question for later because we can talk about critters later on. And then we've got a great location question, actually a couple of them, all about septic systems. If my full area is in the leach field for my septic system, should I build it up there?
So that's a great question, and I've had to deal with that myself. In general, with septic systems, I would encourage you to not build up there, because if you need to access that septic system for some reason, for a leak or whatever, the people that come to work on your septic system will not be happy with you if you have something build up higher on that. And also you do want to avoid having that weight over your septic system for too long. And then in terms of crops, if let's say you want to grow on your leach field, the thing that I've understood is you generally don't want to grow any root crops over a leach field, but things that are shallow rooted, that is probably okay. I in general try to avoid my leach field, but I know for some of us, that's not even a possibility. So avoiding root crops in the leach field is pretty important.
Let's see, anything else? Okay, so someone wants to know about getting soil. We'll talk about getting soil later. So we'll put that aside. And then what about auto exhaust in your front yard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to say that there's differing opinions on that. If you have a front yard where people are really lingering with their cars on and they're going to be idling, that would be nerve-wracking to me also. If it's just a matter of somebody pulling up and parking and turning their car off, I think soap and water on your vegetables is a good tactic. And I know a lot of people do a lot of front yard gardenings. If you know that you are particularly sensitive to that kind of thing, you might not be putting your garden in your front yard. What I'll tell you is that contaminants are everywhere in our modern world. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. They're in the soil, they're in the air, they're in the water, and it's really hard to avoid them altogether. So that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question. It's a little bit of personal preference.
So we have a really good question here about pH. So we talked about getting your soil test so you know your pH, but the question is, why do you need to know the pH?
Oh, that is such a fun question, and I'm going to give you the very short answer because I can give you a 2-hour-long answer on that one. But long story short is that your plants have a certain suite of nutrients that they require for being alive, just like we do. And so nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus are the three big ones, but then there's also 8 major micronutrients that we're not going to go into. And each of those nutrients is mobilized in the soil at a different pH. So certain nutrients become more available as pH increases or gets more basic, and certain nutrients become more available as things get more acidic. And there's a sweet spot in there between the pHs of 6 and 7 where the most nutrients are the most available all at the same time. And so when we can keep our pH between the 6 and 7 range, or even maybe up to 7.3 or 4 or 5, then we're maximizing the nutrition that's available to our plants. Thanks for that question. That's a great one.
So we had a question about sandy soil, and now we've got a couple of questions about clay soils.
Mm-hmm.
And crazily enough, the answer to working with both sandy soils and clay soils is always going to be add compost.
Yes, add organic matter.
But there should be no problem with gardening in clay soils as long as you build your soils up. And then someone else has a question about soil where, it's kind of dark at the top, but then when you get down a few inches, the color of your soil changes.
Okay, so you guys who are new gardeners especially, but also those of you who are gardening on clay soil, this is going to be something you're going to experience a lot. As you garden, each year you're going to be adding more compost, adding more organic matter. And the great news is that there are all these critters that live in the soil already, and they already have the job to take organic matter from the top of the soil and take it down deeper into the soil for you. So this happens in the forest, for example. The leaves fall off the trees in the autumn, and then somehow they go away, right? There's critters that eat them and take them down deeper into the soil where the decomposers live, and they break them down into organic matter that makes nutrients for more plants to grow. So the same thing is going to happen in your garden, especially if you're adding good organic matter and creating a nice soil. So what you'll find is the longer that you garden, each year that depth of the dark stuff on top will continue to increase and go down, 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 down as you build your soil. And so the key is that mostly the top 6 inches of your soil is where most of the roots of your plants are going to live. And so you can accelerate that process a little bit when you're a new gardener by cultivating your soil in some way. We generally encourage no-till gardening at CCE Tompkins, although for those of you who have been using a tiller for a long time, we can give you some tips at some point about how to make that transition. And so what we can do is we can actually work some of that soil into the new soil, the new compost and all that deeper into the soil. But the great news is that the critters will also do it for you. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but we really don't have time to.
So I'm just going to go through a couple more questions here before we move on, because some of these questions we'll address later on. But a quick answer to how do you adjust the pH of your soil? Well, again, the answer is always going to be add compost. So if your soil is too acidic, you can add compost and it'll begin to regulate that down. If your soil is too alkaline, you could add compost and it begins to regulate that as well. If you've got a really strong outlier where you're really strongly acidic or strongly alkaline, you may have to either think about a different spot for your garden, because maybe there was we usually don't have too many outliers. Usually it's within a point or two of the middle that we all garden in. But if we do have a lot of outliers, it might be that there's something that happened in your soil there. Like if it's right near the driveway, did something spill? Did something affect the soil in that space? That's usually the only reason you have super, super acidic or super, super alkaline soils. But generally, compost is going to be your answer. Jenny, you have some more things to say about that too, right?
I will add to that because I know that we have a lot of people here from outside Tompkins County. And so for those of you that are outside Tompkins County, for example, since I'm lived in Oregon, there could be some Oregonians on here. And so those are actually folks where you would have naturally occurring very acidic soil. So generally in Oregon in people's yards, the soil is somewhere in the 5 range, high 5s, and even some parts of the outlying areas in Tompkins County, Brooktondale sometimes has lower pH, and then up where I used to live in Cayuga County, southern Cayuga County, we see a lot of high pHs. So very basic soil. And so if you are in a position where your soil, I would say, is less than 6 or even 5.8 pH or higher than, I'm going to say 7.8 pH, then you might decide that you actually want to amend your soil. And so if you need to bring your soil pH up, make it more basic, you'll be adding lime, agricultural lime. If you need to bring it down, you'll be adding sulfur, and so elemental sulfur. And both of those products are organic. And you want to really be careful about following very specific directions, which I believe we have on our website on the soil testing page. And if you get a soil test and you get pH reading from us, we can give you instructions on how to amend your soil pH. So it is something to be aware of. And the thing I always encourage is to minimize dramatic changes, like and how much money you're spending on these things. So if you think your soil pH might be a little bit off, try growing a garden in it and see what happens, or do a little bit of research on which plants do thrive better in a higher pH. I will tell you that I was gardening last year on pH 8.2. So a lot of people would tell you pH 8.2, you have to add sulfur. And my garden grew just fine. I added tons of compost and I didn't have any issues, and I never used any sulfur. Now, if I wanted to grow blueberries, something that was really acid loving, I would have had to add sulfur, and maybe my productivity on my strawberries was a little bit low, but otherwise I really didn't feel the need to do that. So I always encourage you to do the experiment, see how things go before you make a dramatic change or invest in adding some sort of amendment that you might not need to be spending money on. Okay, how are we doing for questions, Mila? I'm aware of the time.
We have one last one. So
Okay.
Celia has her hand raised. So Celia, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to ask your question. Then we're going to move on to the next section.
Oh,
Hi, Celia.
hi. I have grass-fed sheep. How long must I compost their manure before I can use it?
We'll get into compost and amendments a little bit later, I think, because we have a whole section on amendments.
Okay, sorry, thanks.
No problem. Okay, so let's keep moving on. Thanks, everybody. Let's talk about making your garden beds. All right, so there are so many ways to make new garden beds. We're going to go through a whole bunch of them. In general, though, to start, before we talk about garden beds, I like to say, some of you see this picture here. You see these wooden framed raised beds. And when I use the phrase raised beds, this may be what you pictured. But we're going to talk about actually a bunch of ways to make raised beds where you don't even need to go buy any lumber. You're just going to be creating more soil on top of what you already have. So generally, beds are 3 to 4 feet wide. As a rule, you want to be able to reach the middle of your bed from either side without having to crush plants that are in front of you, right? You're going to be weeding. And if you're somebody, maybe you have some challenges with your back or mobility in general, you want to think about making your beds even more narrow so you don't have to reach so far to get to the middle. And you might think these little logistical things are just extraneous, but when you've been gardening for a while and you spend a lot of time in your garden, being physically capable to keep gardening and keep weeding is really important. So you want to be able to reach the middle of the beds. Your beds should be separated by pathways, and in general, walking on soil, we're going to talk about this again, walking on soil is a bit of a disaster for your garden. So it's nice to have areas that are designated pathways and nice to have areas that are designated garden. In general, I like to have at least 18 inches for a footpath. Or another thing that I like to do that I didn't put on here is if you have grass pathways between your garden, I actually take my lawnmower out there and I use the width of my lawnmower as the width between my beds, because what I want to do is be able to push my lawnmower through there. I want to make only one pass with that lawnmower and I want it to fit perfectly. And so a lot of times we might size the width of our beds or the width of our pathways based specifically on a tool that we're going to regularly use in the garden. If you have a giant wheelbarrow or one of those really big garden carts, you probably want to be able to move that down your pathway. Take that out there and measure it and make sure that you can fit your wheelbarrow or your garden cart down your pathway. It might seem silly in the beginning, like to waste, sort of quote unquote, waste that time. But later on in the season, when you're trying to get your wheelbarrow down your pathway and you don't want to crush your beautiful tomato plants or greens, you'll be happy that you measured in the beginning. Okay, so one thing, again, is super important. So here's a picture of a footprint in your pathway. A soil particle, let me just help you to understand So picture a grain of sand, if you can even picture just one grain of sand. Most of us probably have clay soils. A particle of clay is 1,000 times smaller than a particle of sand. So just picture, see if you can even imagine that. And now imagine you're that teeny tiny particle of clay and a giant foot steps on you. So this is like, being crushed by the biggest dinosaur that ever lived every footstep that you take into your garden. So it really has a dramatic influence on the tilth or the structure of your soil, and also on all those critters that live in it that are the ones that are really doing all the good gardening work for you. So you really don't want to step in your soil that you're going to be growing in. So you really want to create very clear pathways where that's the only place your feet are going to go. Now, I don't know if your dogs, your cats, your kids are going to pay attention to your pathways, but they generally weigh less than us. So that's, good training though for your dog.
And sometimes if I've made a garden bed that's just a little too wide, I'll put a stepping stone right in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that way I know that I can safely put my foot on that one stepping stone, and that's my foot spot, so I can reach other things. But if you're making new beds, you may as well not have to make that mistake and design so that you can reach every spot from your safe standing spots.
Yep. Okay, so you hear a lot about raised beds, especially for those of you living in urban areas. You're probably going to want to use a raised bed, or suburban areas of some kind. Also, for those of you with really heavy clay soil and really heavy sandy soil, you might want a raised bed. Those of you who have dreamy, silty loam soil, you might not need a raised bed, especially if you're in an area where the soils are not toxic.
And what about people who have lots of rocks in their soil?
Oh, people have lots of rocks. Yes, welcome to New York State. We have lots of rocks. That's kind of up to you. If you like picking out rocks, then you can work with lots of rocky soil. If you don't want to deal with that, then go ahead and build up. But a raised bed is any garden bed that's raised above the ground at all. So even this garden bed that you're looking at, this lovely woman working in, you can see that even though there's just a few inches of elevation, that there's soil that has now been added above ground level. And that counts as a raised bed. And why bother using raised beds? Well, one thing is, it's just easier to avoid walking in your beds when you're using a raised bed. But even more importantly is it saves you a lot in the long run of fertilizer, water, labor, and time, because you have this garden soil that is staying in place and accumulating over time. Whereas if let's say we move our pathways each year, now we have to add now we've got organic matter sitting in a place where we're now using it as a pathway. So it's a waste of that matter. We're going to put all of our really good soil and all of our nutrients into the place where plants will always be growing by choice. The other thing is raised beds generally have much better drainage, and that has to do with all the organic matter that you're going to be adding and the cultivation that you do. And they also warm up sooner, which for those of us in New York State, when we're just waiting and waiting and waiting for spring to come, having an area of our garden that actually warms up quicker is good for not just the garden, but for, I'd say, mental health. And so let's talk about some methods for making raised beds. We're going to talk about 3 specific ones. If this was not Veggie Gardening 101, I would give you 8 techniques, but I'm not going to overwhelm you today, or I'm only going to overwhelm you with 3 kinds, actually. So here's, there are 3 kinds we're going to talk about, just a basic kind. We're going to talk about sheet mulching, and we're going to talk about the no-dig method. Okay, so making a raised bed. So the first one is a basic raised bed. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to grab a digging fork or something like that. If you happen to have a broad fork, that's generally not a beginning gardener tool, but some sort of loosening up the soil kind of implement like this woman is holding in the photo. And you're going to loosen up your soil to a depth of at least 2 to 3 inches. If you can loosen deeper down to 6 inches, that's great. It's a little more physical work, but none of us can go to use our gym memberships right now, if that's what you have. So this is a great time to get your workout in the garden. The next thing you want to do is add 2 to 3 inches a layer of compost to the top. Now, a lot of times people ask the question, should I turn the soil? And this slide actually says turn it to 6 inches. I'm going to actually question that. It really depends on your garden and on your soil. So if you're standing on really, really tough clay, I would encourage you the first year that you do this to go ahead and turn your soil. You probably don't have great soil structure in there. You probably have had, most of us are living in places where our soil has been pretty abused. If you had like a perfectly pristine soil, maybe you're going into build your garden in a place where there's been a pasture for 30 years, then you probably don't need to turn your soil. But for the rest of us, the first time you go out there, we're going to be integrating this organic matter pretty deeply to accelerate that process. What I would say then is after, in future years, you don't want to turn your soil. You're now going to have created enough of a nice, light, fluffy bed that now we can let the critters that do this, that's their job, turn the soil for us, and they're going to do it in a way that's much more amenable to the ecosystem function of your garden. Scattering nitrogen fertilizer, that is an optional thing. What I like to say is if you're growing a high nitrogen crop, and we probably won't go into what those are today, but as you use some of the resources we send you, you'll get to find out some of those. But a great example is corn. Corn loves tons of nitrogen. If you are going to be planting a big bed of corn, and you know that your soil has, kind of classic clay and it's not very good, you might scatter a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer. And we use, there's various forms of organic nitrogen fertilizer, including fish meal and alfalfa meal. There's vegan options and options that include animal products. But if you have a really good compost, you don't need to do that. Again, you're going to create beds that you can reach to the middle without hurting your back. And you're going to shovel pathways between your raised beds. And that's really, again, to help you with the drainage, to help things warm up. You're going to then rake your beds level and add mulch or rocks or whatever to the path. I like to discourage rocks, actually. I feel like anytime we can avoid adding rocks to soil is probably a great plan here in New York State, but for some of us, that's what we have to work with. So this is step one. And this is just you're basically creating sort of a mini elevated mound on the earth. So no wood is required. Very few supplies are needed for this. You really just need some compost and a digging fork. And you can do this just about anywhere. If you're somebody who has really shallow soil like Mila does, this is a technique that is not going to work for you. If you have super toxic soil, super leady soil, you don't want to use this technique. So we're going to go on to a couple others that might work in those scenarios. Okay, this is one of my favorite techniques. It's called sheet mulching.
And mine too. And it's really the best solution if you have either shallow soil with a lot of rocks, or you just really want to build up. It does require a little bit of patience though.
Yeah, so with sheet mulching, you can see there's these different layers here. And essentially the long story, I'm going to see if I have one more slide on it. Okay, no, I don't. The long story short on sheet mulching is what you're doing is you're alternating things that are made of carbon and things that are made of nitrogen. And soil is essentially built up from a combination of carbon and nitrogen containing materials. And so these organic materials. And so what you're going to do is start on the bottom. So this first layer on the very bottom is going to be composed of, usually what we're going to do is put down something that's going to kill the grass or whatever weeds are there. So that's generally newspaper or cardboard after you've pulled off all the staples and all the tape out, and you can just lay down a really thick layer. I like to lay down 2 layers of cardboard or even like 3 layers of newspaper. You want to make sure that those are really overlapping because weeds are smarter than you are. No offense, they're smarter than me too. And they will find their way up through the cracks if you have left a crack for them. So you really want them overlapping. And then before you pile anything else on top of it, you want to make sure that that layer is thoroughly soaked and wet. So all of this sheet mulch material needs to be wet. And in fact, if you want to give your kids an activity to do, the funnest thing, the best way to deal with getting these wet is to take a kiddie pool and fill it with water and let your cardboard soak in there before you even put it out. Or if you know it's going to rain, go leave the cardboard out in the rain and let the rain do the work for you. Then the next layer you're going to put on is something that has a lot of nitrogen. So easy ways to create a lot of nitrogen are grass clippings. So freshly mowed grass clippings work amazing for this. Another thing you could use is a compost or animal manure. So for the person who was asking about her sheep, you could put totally hot sheep manure right on top of the cardboard here because we're not going to be planting into it immediately. And then what you're going to continue to do is alternate things that have carbon and things that have nitrogen. I like to make each layer about 2 to 3 inches tall. And so, for example, you might add next some straw is a great example of something that's carbon, or leaves that you've raked up from your garden, a leaf pile. You can even use if you're pruning your fruit trees, for example, you can even use the prunings from your fruit trees in these lower layers. And then as you alternate going up, you're going to use things that get smaller and smaller in particle size. So for example, if we're using prune tree branches at the bottom, then we might use the grass clippings higher toward the top. If you want to keep it really simple, you can literally just alternate straw and manure, straw, manure, straw, manure, straw and compost, or leaves and compost. And then slowly over time, what's going to happen is that all those carbon and nitrogen are going to get blended all together by all the critters that do all the composting, and they're going to essentially create for you a giant compost pile right on top of your soil in the shape of a bed. And this is just absolutely dreamy to plant into. Your plants will love it. The pro on this,
plant into in a few months, not right away.
Yes, exactly. So the pro on this is that it's really inexpensive and super easy. This is all stuff you can gather from around your neighborhood. But the con is this thing is not ready to plant right away. So a lot of times when I'm going to sheet mulch something, I will do it in the fall to get ready for spring. Or if you go out and you sheet mulch something now, you probably won't be planting into it until maybe in July or August. If you keep it in a nice warm spot that's pretty sunny, and keep it well watered, it will compost down faster. The other thing I will do sometimes when I'm making a raised bed like this, if I really want to use it soon, is I'll make the top layer of a good solid 6 inches of compost, and I'll specifically plant vegetable starts in there or shallow rooted things on top. Like you probably could plant spinach onto a new sheet mulch if you just add a nice thick layer of compost at the top, but you won't be able to plant some of your deeper rooted things like tomatoes into it until it's been sitting around for probably 3 to 6 months. But this is super cheap and easy, and you're gonna have super beautiful soil. And this is kind of what a sheet mulch garden bed would look like while it's composting. So these guys have covered it in straw. So the reason they've done that is in order to keep the weeds out of it. So you wanna make sure once you've created this beautiful garden bed that you have it covered in some way, because of course the weeds are not going to wait to find out if this is a great place to garden for 6 months. They're going to settle in right away. So covering it up in some way that'll also help hold the heat and the moisture in. Another thing I like to use to cover things up is if you happen to have burlap bags around, or I like to get them from coffee roasters. I get those soaking wet and I'll cover it with burlap bags. So you can get pretty creative with that. Just don't use, go ahead.
Oh, no. Actually, I want you to back up to the previous slide.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who want your instant gratification, and I've done some instant gratification gardens, what I do is rather than make this kind of garden bed that will take a lot longer, it'll make a lot of rich soil, but it takes longer. What I'll do is I'll still start with the same process of putting down lots of cardboard or thick layers of newspaper right on top of my grass. We had a few questions about what to do over grass. This can go right on top of the grass. You don't have to do anything to the grass. You don't have to dig it or turn it or anything like that. This is a great way to be lazy about your garden and get a garden fast. So right on top of your grass where you want your garden bed, lay down your thick cardboard and newspaper. And then what I'll do is I'll just lay down, and this requires more compost and soil. So if you have an access to a lot of good soil or can get a delivery and have the means to do that, the quick way to do it is just to put that soil down on top of that the cardboard. And I would plant right into that soil for this season. And again, like Jenny said, shallow rooted things. And that way I have basically a garden bed instantly. What I will do though is that fall, I will go through this process in that same spot, so that the following year I have a richer garden.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Awesome. Okay, let's keep moving. So third technique called the no-dig method. What we're going to do in this case is, this is something that you can plant into pretty quickly. There are 2 different options here. You can do this with cardboard or without cardboard. If you want to be really quick about it and be planting into it immediately, you can actually not use cardboard in this situation. In that case, you're going to weed the area and you're just going to, like weed it like crazy. I like to dig the fork in a little bit. And then you can either lay down wet cardboard, which I notice in this picture, their cardboard doesn't look very wet. And then we're just gonna add 4 to 8 inches of compost and plant right into it. So there are pluses and minuses to this. This one is really fast. You're just gonna be over and done with really quickly. The minus on this one is you really need to buy a lot of compost if you don't have this compost at home, and that's gonna cost you. You know, if the vegetables that you're going to get out of it are worth it in the end, but if finances are limiting, this is probably a trickier way to get it done. And so that's, you know, I generally don't do this technique except for maybe if I'm creating a new bed and I just want to plant into it immediately, but I really try and craft my gardening plans such that I don't end up doing this too often. The other thing to know is, we're kind of assuming that you all have not such great soil because that's really common in Ithaca, but you may have fantastic soil, in which case all you have to do is go and, just like in that first technique, get rid of all the plants that are there, weed them, pull them out, and add a tiny bit of compost and start planting. But for most of us, we're just not gifted with that incredible soil. So raised beds can be surrounded by wood. And what I would say is, if you live in an area where you have pets, children, neighbors that walk their dogs by, anything where the differentiation between your garden and the rest of the yard is not totally clear, raised beds that are surrounded by wood can really add an element of declaring this is the garden. The other thing is, you can see in this picture, for example, they've raised their beds. These boards are 8 inches wide, so they've raised their bed 16 inches tall. That's less bending over for you. So for a lot of folks, that can be really nice, especially if you're physically limited in that way. Another thing is, with a bed like this that's just really clearly defined, it can really add a really beautiful element to your garden, the physical structure. It really discourages people from walking in it. And like I said, it can look really nice. And it's also, you know, how these are each 8-inch boards. It's really impossible to build a bed that's going to have a 16-inch addition of soil without a structure to hold that in. And so if you have really poor soil, really toxic soil, then a raised bed that's surrounded by wood will really allow you to maximize how much soil you're bringing in.
So there's a wonderful landscape architect researcher named Joan Nassauer, who has this really great research done on how people perceive gardens. So for those of you who are looking to maybe use your front yard area for gardening and you're worried about what the neighbors think, having that raised bed is excellent. So she has this theory she puts forward about the idea of messy ecosystems in orderly frames. So if you put a nice, easy, well-constructed box around it, everyone who walks by knows that that spot is intentional. It's not just that you made a mess, it's that you actually created this space and you're being very intentional about how you use that space. And what that does is that your neighbors tend to perceive it differently and perceive it better than if you just had an open, uncontained raised bed. So think about that when you're thinking about any of your gardening uses. If your edges are neat, people perceive it as being well taken care of and intentional, even if the stuff inside of that edge is really messy.
Okay, so we're going to answer a few more questions here. I'm also aware that we have so many great questions and so much information. It's already after 11. So I can see the questions too, Mila, so I'm just going to start answering a few. Let's see, can I clarify what it means to turn? Yes, turning the soil, when I talk about turning the soil, which in general is something I encourage you to avoid, that's basically when we're taking the layers that are lower down on the soil and mixing them with the layers that are higher up in the soil. So soil has a structure to it, and that has evolved over time. As you know, from this ecosystem perspective, organic matter enters from the top in the form of leaves falling on the ground, and then soil, the mineral particles that are derived from the rocks that are buried deep in the earth, or in the case of Mila's yard, very shallow in the earth, those are creating the mineral soils. And there is a dance of integration between the organic soils and the mineral soils, and that job is generally done by the critters, the microflora and microfauna and some macrofauna, big critters that live in the soil. But sometimes when we're gardening and we have really bad soil, we do a little bit of that mixing for the critters to be able to accelerate that process. when we do that, we damage our soil. We're actually damaging the soil. But in the case of, for a lot of us, our soils are already so damaged that we actually need to do a little more damage before we can have some healing. It's kind of like soil surgery, so to speak. And so when we're doing that, we often will turn our soil the very first time that we work on our garden just to integrate this organic matter, but then we're going to stop doing it so that those natural processes can take over and heal the soil and take it from there. Sophie's asking, doesn't soil need air? Absolutely, Sophie. Soil really needs air. That's one of the challenges with clay soil is it really has these teeny tiny soil particles, and it's really hard for the soil to hold air. So as we turn the soil, that is one of the things we're doing, is integrating air. But again, the great news is that those critters that live in the soil, that's one of their jobs, is as they're going through their processes of moving through and eating organic matter and pooping out the things that they poop out, they create these pore spaces in the soil, and those hold air. Julie asks, what if you're starting your, oh, we've answered this one. If you're starting your raised bed on a lawn, yep, you don't need to dig out the soil. Kim, you asked about if you can repeat the layers in the sheet mulch, and yes, you can repeat the layers, but what I would not do is repeat the cardboard. So the cardboard is just gonna go on the grass, and then after that, we want things that are gonna decompose a lot more quickly, going upward. If you don't have access to straw, I would recommend leaves as sort of the easiest thing to get your hands on. If you become a hardcore gardener, you'll become something like me. I call myself a biomass scavenger, and I'm like the weirdo who's standing at the end of their driveway with binoculars, waiting for my neighbors to mow their lawn so I can come and steal their grass clippings from my sheet mulch pile. I see my neighbors that are raking their leaves, and I go and I ask for their leaves so that I can create these biomass piles to get ready for sheet mulching. So you'll know you're a real gardener when you start stalking your neighbors to steal their organic matter.
So the one note, if you only have like things like cardboard available, you can use it as another layer if you shred it up.
Yes, good point.
So that's one thing that I'll suggest is a shredded cardboard as your additional layer is a perfectly acceptable one. And then most of us have access to grass clippings pretty easily. And the thing about grass clippings is you can use them for both a nitrogen and a carbon source. So if your grass clippings are fresh, they're still green and still wet, then they're a nitrogen source. If you lay them out and let them kind of dry out and then rake them up, they become a carbon source, because as they dry, they leach out their nitrogen. So depending on what your needs are, you can either pile up your grass clippings fresh into your layered garden, or you can let them dry out and use them as a carbon.
Julie's asking if you can use plastic sheeting in the fall to speed the breakdown of the newly sheet mulch beds. I'll say that you can, but it's not ideal. We want water to be infiltrating into those beds. And then the other thing I'll say is all the critters that live underneath that are going to be doing all this work for you, all this hard work that you don't have to do now, those guys really, not only do they need the moisture to stay consistent, they also need the temperature to stay fairly consistent. And so by using plastic, you may be making the temperature actually a little too hot for them. And so I would say if you have another choice, to not use plastic. The Levy family is asking about where you can buy good compost, and I would encourage you to email your grow line or your hotline, garden hotline for wherever you're located, and ask them for a list, and they will send you one. Let's see. Yes, somebody said Cayuga compost. Yep, that's a great one. Let's see. I'm just reading. If you use the
Best time of year.
Oh, go ahead.
Best time of year to start beds.
Best time of year to start beds is like last year. No, I'm just kidding. The best time of year to start a bed, I would say, is the fall. And that's partly just because you're going to get maximum amount of time for things to break down. And also here in Tompkins County and probably the rest of New York State, spring is fast and furious. So what happens here is the snow melts. And then depending on the year, 2 weeks later, it's like 85 degrees. I mean, we had that last year. So in the spring, there is already so much to do in the garden that if you have tasks that you can move to the fall, you'll find a lot more spaciousness and time for that. So I like to build all my new beds in the fall, and that gives them maximum amount of time to break down. It is colder while they're trying to break down, so they might not be completely broken down when the snow melts in the spring. But if you are needing, if you need to build something in the spring, it will break down much faster because you're going to have the warm temperatures of summer, but also it won't be available to use in the spring. And I think as you become new gardeners, you'll find that we're so excited for spring. And also, at least here in upstate New York, spring is a dead sprint for a gardener, is just trying to get everything in before it gets hot. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mila.
No, that's great.
Yeah, okay. And also, in the interest of time, I'm going to say, Mila is also monitoring the chat, and you'll see that she's sometimes answering your question right in the chat, because we have so many amazing people on here. We're now up to over 150 people on this call with us, which I just want to say again how grateful I am to be here with all of you. But I'm going to keep going on the slideshow, and Mila, let you keep answering in the chat, and then we can come back around at the end if we have more time and address more of these questions. Sound good? Okay, so let's talk about making a planting plan. And here's what I want to tell you. Some of us are planners and some of us aren't. And when you are a gardener, you do not have to check your personality at the door. So if you are not a planner and creating a garden plan gives you total anxiety, I invite you to ignore this next section. You don't have to be a planner to have a great garden. Then there are some of you that without a plan, you will never do anything without a plan. You want to pay really close attention to this section, because I'm going to teach you the very basics of how to make a plan. I will tell you, Mila just led a 3-part, 6-hour class on creating and designing a plan. So we're about to do in 3 slides what can take a very long time, but I'm going to give you some basics. And yeah, I just really invite you to let yourself be yourself in your garden. And so if you're just going to go and loosen up some soil and throw some seeds into it, that is gardening. Wholeheartedly, that is gardening. And if you're going to have an incredible plan, let's do that too. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to the common crop chart, and I apologize, with so many people registered, I was intending to send this to you via email before, but people were just registering every 5 seconds all the way up to the end. So when you get your email with the follow-up, you will get a PDF of this common crop chart. But this common crop chart is a great tool to have, and we're going to send you one version. Pretty much every seed company that's out there has a version of a common crop chart also. And what I want to just do is go across. So if you look at the top, it has the name of the crop. It's going to tell you the planting window for that crop. So we'll talk a little bit later about the seasonality of different crops. The next column, the 3rd column over, is the footprint of that crop. We need to know how big our plants are going to get. And we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail, because they're certainly not the same size when you plant them as when you harvest them. And we need to be planning for their harvest size. The next thing is our planting method. And I'm sorry, this is probably small for some of you on teeny little screens, but like I said, we'll be sending it to you. You need to know, do you need to seed this, direct seed it, or can you transplant it, or both? And then are there specific techniques you need to use? So this is going to give you that information crop by crop. Also, you want to know how tall your plant is going to get, and we're going to talk about that. Another thing you need to know is how long from when I plant this to when I harvest it. So we need to know, for example, some things you're going to put in the ground and 40 days later, you're going to pull them out of the ground. Well, if you're a planter, then you want to know what's going to come right after that. There's other things that you're going to put in the ground in April or May, and they are going to stay there all the way till November. So you need to know something about that. Another thing you'll want to know is, can this plant handle a little bit of shade? And then the final column, which is not a beginning gardener technique or concept, but I'm still going to introduce you to it, is if you're going to use a succession. And we'll talk about that a little later. So I know some of you are going to want to ask, what is succession planting? Just put that out of your head for a minute. We'll talk about it in a moment. Okay, so creating a plan. When you're creating your plan, what I encourage you to consider are the following. Foods you enjoy. And so one of the things I first do, without thinking at all about what is possible, just make a list of your favorite foods that your family likes to eat that are vegetables or fruits. Just make a big list. Sky's the limit. Don't even worry about if it grows here yet. Just make the list and have a little fun with that. Then you can go through that list and decide what is realistic. So if your kids help you with the list and they write down mangoes, then you get to have a little biology lesson about where mangoes live and where they don't live, and that we won't be growing those in our garden. But finding out what is actually realistic for your area. Now that might be like what can grow here. that also might be about whether or not you have seeds for it, or whether you can get transplants at your local nursery, or maybe you had one of those soils that was a little strange on the pH and you aren't going to be able to grow it, or so there's a number of reasons you might not be able to grow something. Maybe you know your soil has like really poor nitrogen and you're going to not grow corn, or maybe something's unrealistic because it takes up too much space. We'll talk about that too. For a lot of us, we're gardening on a budget. So what is cost effective? And so, for example, one of the things I like to think about is what are things that I like to eat that are really expensive to buy. So tomatoes are a great example of that. Probably some of us have gone to the farmer's market before, put a single tomato on the scale and gasped when that one tomato was $5, right? It's worth it. They're so delicious. But if you're not someone who has $5 to spend on a tomato and you love tomatoes, then tomatoes is a great example of something to buy. Whereas maybe something like potatoes, they're like 99 cents a pound at the grocery store, is something that you might not make space for because it's just affordable to buy. And so that's something that you can be thinking about. And then space limitations. We'll talk a little bit about, there are certain plants that take up a really lot of space. If anybody here's ever grown a pumpkin plant for a jack-o'-lantern, that one plant will take up more than your 4x8 raised garden bed. So maybe if you only have a 4x8 raised garden bed or two, you're gonna not grow pumpkins. And then the last thing you're going to be thinking about is what season is it that you're planning for? So we're going to talk about that in a moment, but certain plants need a lot of heat. You're not going to plant a tomato in April, for example. And so we'll talk about that too. Okay, so what is in season? So the first thing you're going to be thinking about as you're planting is what is in season in the window you're planting in. So I've highlighted here this first row, oops, sorry. The planting window. So for example, let's just pick a crop that you can plant really early, and we're going to look at kale. So if you look down to the K for kale, you'll see that you can plant kale from April to July 31st. And I would even argue you can keep going after July 31st. And in some cases, if you have a really, really warm spot, you might be able to, and you might be able to see kale as early as right now. It probably will get snowed on and it will probably be okay because it is upstate New York and we are in March. So I'm guessing we have another snow in for us at some point. Whereas if you take a look and go to summer squash, for example, way down, it's under squash at the bottom. That says you can plant in June, not plant till June. So squashes are generally tropical plants. They don't want to have anything to do with our soil, which I haven't measured the soil temperature recently, but I would guess it's probably somewhere in the high 40s, maybe low 50s. A squash seed is just going to rot in a soil that has that temperature. So a lot of these planting windows have to do with air temperature, but they also have to do with soil temperature. So when we think about those seeds that are going in the ground or the roots, they do care about the air, but they also really care about the temperature of the soil. And so these planting windows are really important. Again, this is one of those things that as you become a gardener, it will become second nature to you to know what are spring crops to plant, what are summer crops to plant, what are fall crops to plant, what are things you can even take over the winter here in New York State. And that will become second nature soon. Okay, the next thing you're going to be thinking about is the space. This is really important for your planting plan. So the footprint of a plant is the space it takes up in square inches. And you'll notice these are, we've in this column, we've generalized them to sort of different categories. So 4 inches by 4 inches, 12 inches by 12 inches. Things can get bigger and bigger. Tomatoes down, if you look at tomatoes way down toward the bottom, it says 36 inches by 36 inches. Of course, with each of these plants, depending on your soil type, depending on how much fertilizer you're using, depending on how often you water them, the size can vary dramatically. But these are just a general rule for your planting. And let's just talk about that whole spacing thing. So here's an example. One pumpkin plant. This is a picture of a pumpkin plant. It takes up a ton of space, and you're just going to get a few pumpkins. Now I don't have anything against pumpkins, but if you don't have a big garden, it might not be the best use of your time, unless of course your only goal in life is to make a toddler happy with giving them a jack-o'-lantern, in which case take up your whole garden with pumpkins. But then here's an example, a chard plant. takes up this tiny, tiny space, probably 4 by 4 square inches, and you get a ton of greens. And I would even one up this slide and say, instead of chard, if I had a really small space, I would skip right to beets, because then you get a beet root and beet greens, which are they're cousins with chard, and they taste very similar. And you can get a lot of food from a very little space. So understanding those footprints and how big things are going to be is critical. But also, if you're starting with starts or seeds, you really want to be aware of the difference between the size of your plant when you plant it and the size of your plant at maturity. So a mistake that Mila and I see all the time is people planting their tomatoes or other things like broccoli way too close together, because when you get your start, it's this tiny, tiny little thing, 5 inches by 5 inches, sometimes even 3 inches by 3 inches. But that tomato is going to grow fast and furious, and it's going to be 36 inches by 36 inches possibly by the time you're done, depending on how you trellis it, and you need to leave room for that. So really, really being aware of how big your plants will be at maturity. And so here's a great example. Here's what a tomato start looks like on the left, and there's mature tomatoes on the right. Now, if that person had put all those tomatoes just 4 inches apart, like they could have when they planted, you can imagine what a jungle it would be and how much that would impact the growth of the plants. A lot of people think that when they plant things close together, they think, well, that's okay, I'll just plant more tomatoes and I'll still get just as much. Well, that's actually not gonna work out for you in that way. These plants underground, they all have their root systems, and those root systems are competing with one another. So just because you have them close together and you've planted more doesn't mean that you'll still get just as much plant. You've really now stressed your plants because you're asking them to compete just a little too much. Also, we want to plan for the height of our plants at maturity. So you can imagine you buy a tomato start at the store or at the nursery, or maybe you've grown it at home. It's maybe 4 or 6 inches tall when you put it in the ground. Some of those tomatoes are indeterminate tomatoes. That means they just keep growing forever. They can be 12 feet tall by the time that you're done growing them. And so we need to be aware that some of our plants are going to create shade for other plants and put that into our planting plan. Now, you may be wondering, I could have asked you to put this in the chat box, and that would have been smart of me, which side of your garden you want to put your tall plants on. Well, hopefully you chose your garden site really well. You have a southern exposure, which is where the sunlight is going to be coming from, and the heat. And so in order to avoid shading your short plants, you're going to plant your tallest plants to the north and your shortest plants to the south. And that will help you from creating a shadow from one plant to the other. Okay, so planting dates. So another thing in that planting window, planting at the right time is going to reduce not just your damage from frost or hot weather, but in general, it's going to reduce the stress on your plants. You know, one of the things that we see a lot also is people putting plants in the ground that are really stressed out to begin with. That is just not a great way for a plant to thrive. And in fact, a lot of times people think, oh, it's okay, it'll recover, or I'll just give it some fertilizer. There's a certain extent to which that's effective, but then there's also the problem of a weak plant invites pests, it invites diseases, it invites things that you don't want to be around your other healthy plants. So pests and disease prey on weak plants. It's just like, you know, it's nature, right? And it's wild out there. And so by putting stressed out plants into your garden, you're now inviting all of this to be in the presence of your maybe healthy, stronger plants. So getting the planting date right will really be an effective way for you to reduce the stress on your plants. I'm going to encourage you when you're choosing plants at the nursery, for example, a lot of times it's really fun to be like, go over to the sales section and see like, oh yeah, this, you know, these tomatoes got super leggy and they're super stressed, and I'm going to save some money and I'm going to buy them. I've done this experiment 1,000 times because I'm very frugal, and it almost never works out for me. In the end, what happens is I've now spent some money on something that really didn't do well, and in a lot of cases it stressed out my other plants, and I could have just taken some time and planted something else there. Also, for a lot of your crops, you want to make sure that there's enough days before the harvest before your first frost. Now, for beginning gardeners, you may not struggle with this quite as much, but I'm going to give you an example, which I always struggle with, which is butternut squash. So if any of you love butternut squash, those big, big, huge squashes, they're my favorite things to make pies from. And a butternut squash in general is about 110 days from the time when you put that seed in the ground to the time when you harvest it. Well, our growing season here in upstate New York can range, depending on the year, from anywhere from 120 or 130 days all the way up to 150 days. But let's say we have a late snow and I put my butternut squash in the ground. I don't get around to it till maybe the second week of June. I don't any longer have 110 days before it gets too cold for that to ripen. So for some of these longer lived crops that have 110 days as their, or even over 90 days, you really want to be thoughtful about getting them in the ground on time, because there's nothing worse than letting a butternut squash plant occupy all that space and all that time and then not having any squash to eat at the end of it all. So I encourage you, especially as beginning gardeners, to stick to crops that maybe mature a little bit more quickly than that. Okay, so planning. So we're thinking about the timing, we're thinking about all these things. I also want to introduce you to a concept called crop rotation. And this is an example of a thing where we're going to touch the surface of this, but we could be teaching you an entire class on. And so what I would say to you as a beginning gardener is, please don't let crop rotation stop you from gardening. I'm going to invite you, if this concept is too much for you, to just ignore me, because I don't want to do anything to inhibit you from gardening. And I want to also invite you, if this feels graspable, to start to think about how you're going to rotate your crops. So the reason we rotate crops is so that we can avoid pest and disease accumulation in one spot. So just like we have families, plants also have families. They tend to be related to each other. For example, some of you might be familiar with the tomato family, which is also called the nightshade family. And things that are related to tomatoes include tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, potatoes. If anybody's ever used the herb ashwagandha, it's a good stress relieving herb for a lot of us right now. Ashwagandha is in the tomato family. And there are diseases that are very specific, diseases and insects, to each of the plant families. And so by rotating the crops, as we have those insect and disease and pathogens accumulate in our soil, those pathogens are also very specific to which family they like. So things that generally like to prey on things in the tomato family maybe don't have an effect at all on things in the squash family. So by year after year, moving these crops around so that we aren't repeating the same family in the same place at the same time, we can start to break some of these pest cycles. But like I said, if this concept is overwhelming for you, ignore it in the beginning. This will be your experiment that you start to work on as you get more comfortable with gardening. But you can start to learn some of the plant families, and we're not going to go over them in detail here, but the big ones that are listed here are the squash family, tomato family, the legumes, which are the beans and peas, the beet family, the carrot family, and the cabbage family. Now, what they didn't list here, and I would say is the most important one to know, is the onion family. The onion family, what I'll tell you is, if you are going to rotate nothing, you're like, I'm not doing crop rotation, Jenny, this is way too much. I'm going to ask you to rotate one and only one thing, and that is the onion family, specifically if you grow garlic. So one thing that happens with garlic is garlic can get a disease, a couple of different root pathogen diseases, and those diseases can last in the soil up to 7 to 9 years. So if you get those diseases, you then can't grow garlic and onions for 7 to 9 years. So we really want to avoid getting those diseases. So if you're going to rotate nothing else, I would just encourage you to rotate your onions and your garlic. And by rotation, all I mean is don't place them in the same place year after year. A good rule is to wait 3 cycles, so 3 seasons or 3 years until you plant something in the same place. So if I plant my tomatoes in one location, then I would move them to another location the next year and another location the next year, and then I would bring them back to that original location. Now, some of us have a 4x8 garden bed and we don't have this luxury at all. If that's you, don't worry about crop rotation. Think of it as frosting on the cake. And then there are certain crops that you're just never going to rotate, maybe because they're tall and there's only one place in your garden they can go, Or maybe you've built the most amazing, cool pea trellis with your kids. And you're like, I can't rotate my peas because I want them to go on this trellis every single year. That's fine. You're not going to worry about that. If you happen to have a year where you have a really bad pest year, let's say you get really bad septoria leaf blight, and we don't need to go into what that is, but it's a disease of tomatoes, and you planted your tomatoes in the same place year after year, and then one year you get septoria, then that's going to be the year you're going to be like, okay, now I'm going to start rotating my tomatoes. And so that's sort of the basics of crop rotation. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on this one. And like I said, we can go a lot deeper into this. And maybe Mila, we'll make a note.
And
Just
well, I'll say one thing about the crop rotation.
Yeah.
I think if nothing else, just know that crop rotation is a concept that exists.
Yeah. Right.
And when you make your drawn plan, so I do strongly suggest that you just take a piece of paper and sketch out, even in just like big blobs, like here are tomatoes and here's my cilantro. Just save it for next year. And what will happen is next year around January or February, you're going to get seed catalogs in the mail, and you're going to start thinking about your vegetable garden again. So that's when you're going to pull out this year's planting plan that you drew, and you're going to say, well, I'm going to put this in a different spot. So don't even worry about it for this year if it's your first year gardening, because there's nothing to rotate. But keep a hold of the concept in your brain somewhere in the back, so that next year when you're planning next year's garden, you pull out this year's garden and you can figure out what to put where.
Good call. Very good. Okay, so we have this pause for questions. I'm going to note that it's 11:30, which I'm not surprised about because there is so much to share here. So we're going to have a brief pause for questions. Also want to invite you if you need to stand up and stretch. But what I would love to do while you are doing all that is also invite you to put into the chat box, just to take a moment to reflect, just one thing that you have learned that you're going to take away and implement or do in your garden. And you can just go ahead and type it in there. Just anything that you feel like, really struck you as something that, a piece of information that you're going to walk away with.
Okay, so I'm going to keep the questions, I've collected them all, but I'm going to only bring up questions that have to do about planting and spacing.
Mm-hmm.
And selection. So right now, let's see. Someone wanted to know about how they always lose their tomatoes to tomato blight. So how would you choose tomatoes so that you don't have that problem?
Okay, we are going to get to that in the seed selection section coming up right next.
Okay, great. And then someone wanted to know about if they want to grow some of these things in containers, how big a container do they need? How will they use that chart to know how big a container they need?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. I think that chart is a great place to start. And so you can really use that footprint piece to figure out how big of a container you need. The great news is that plants in general are pretty adaptable. So for example, most of us don't have like one of those big old wine barrel planters sitting around to plant our tomato into. And so I would say you can get away with a tomato with something like a 5-gallon bucket that you've drilled holes into the bottom of. But in general, you can use that chart to figure out how big the pot needs to be. And in general, again, when you're growing container plants, the bigger the container, the better. So the limitation about a container plant is it can only hold as much water as that soil can hold. So if you have a plant that is in a small container, you are going to have to water that plant every day. And if it's in a really small container, let's say you had, just your typical terracotta pot, and you decide, I'm going to grow broccoli in there. On a hot, sunny day, you might need to water that broccoli even 2 or 3 times just to keep that water soaked, because you only have that much soil to hold water. So the bigger container that you can put something in, the better. And so I would say, now if you get into something where it's really small and you're putting it in a giant container, then we don't want to do that, because the weed seeds are going to come in and they're going to just settle right in all around it. But you really want to have something where that container is going to get you through an entire day without needing to be watered again. And I wish I could give you like an exact size, but that is the key.
You can look at the chart, and if it says 12 inches by 12 inches, you know that your container should be about 12 inches around. As far as depth is concerned, think about how big that plant is. A tomato plant can get pretty tall, and so you're going to want a deeper container. Spinach plants, lettuce plants are only going to be, maybe 6 or 8. Some of the giant like romaines might get like 12 and 14 inches tall. They don't need as much volume underneath. So there's at least a little bit of a relationship between the size of the plant above and the size of the plant below. There's a couple of outliers where that's a little bit different, but for your beginning gardening, just think about the thing above. The bigger it is, the more space it needs below.
That is such a great point, Mila. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yep.
And then we have one other question about spacing and planting.
Okay.
So just in general, to reiterate the spacing, like how far apart to space these things, just go to your chart and see how much space that item needs, and make sure you have kind of like an imaginary circle around the center of that plant. And then once you're outside of that circle, you can plant the next thing.
That's right.
You want those circles to touch but not overlap when you're spacing things. And then the last question we had about spacing was someone had some fruit trees and wants to know how far away from the fruit trees to plant the veggies.
Oh, that's a great question. So that really depends on, I'm going to back up to the last question. I think you can all see my hand. So I think when you're thinking about how much plants can overlap, for anything that is producing you're going to eat the leaves, the flowers, or the fruits. You want their canopies to touch without overlapping. So they're not going to overlap, they're just going to touch. And that's when they're fully grown. If it's something that's growing underground and it's a root, so I'm now going to say that my hands are carrots, you can have those carrots when they're fully grown, they can touch, but you don't want them overlapping because then they're going to impede each other. So something like a carrot, for example, I plant those really close together. And beets really close together. So when my beets are mature, I'm harvesting them, they're literally touching each other. And so, yeah, that's the general rule is plant canopies should touch but not overlap. And then roots can touch again, but not overlap. So root crops you can plant generally quite a bit closer together. The one exception to that is potatoes, because they're making multiples underneath the ground. They really need to be quite a distance apart. But otherwise, that's sort of the story. And then the fruit trees, that really depends on what is growing underneath and how big your fruit trees are. So if you have dwarf fruit trees, you can have dwarf fruit trees right in your garden, especially if you keep them toward the north side of your garden. You can also use trees strategically to create shade. So some of our plants, like lettuce is a great example of something that grows really well in the spring and the fall, but in the summer, there's just a little too much heat for lettuce. So we can strategically use our trees to create shade for things where we actually want to cool things down. Lettuce is a really good example of that, or any sort of greens, spinach, tatsoi, which is an Asian spinach that I absolutely love. And so the great news about tree roots is that tree roots are incredibly good for promoting fungal diversity in your soil. And as we talked about a little bit, fungal diversity in your soil is what is going to create really good soil. So having tree roots nearby your garden is actually a great way to enhance your soil. Also, though, you have to think a little bit about when you're planting something underneath a tree or near a tree, are the roots of your plant and the roots of that tree going to mingle with each other? So we don't want that. We don't want them competing. So an example there would be tomatoes. If any of you has planted a tomato before and then you go dig it out at the end of the season, I mean, tomatoes, like Mila was explaining, sort of the as above, so below, tomato roots can be 8 feet deep. So we're not going to have a tomato plant competing with our trees. Whereas, for example, spinach is very shallow rooted and would grow just fine near one of your trees. And so you'll start to learn some of that, what's shallow rooted and what's deep rooted. A lot of those lessons that you learn will come as you clean up your first garden, actually. So anything else in there, Mila? Oh, you may be muted, Mila. Okay. Well,
there we go. Okay, we have a lot of questions about composting and how to use composting and how to incorporate composting. So what I'm going to say is we probably don't have a ton of time to get into that because that's a really big subject. But what I'll do is I'll put a link in here to our composting pages over at CCE Tompkins, and there's lots of great information there. And our Master Composter program is a really active one, so feel free to reach out to them if there are very specific questions that you have about your specific kind of compost, and they'll be happy to answer that.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. The master composting program has, I mean, actually Mila has created a lot of these resources as part of a former job that she had here working with master composting. I see a question about best place to get compost and best place to get seeds. We'll hold that best place to get seeds till later. And compost, I would say it really depends on where you're from and also times for what kind of compost you're using. So in terms of what kind of compost folks are using, again, you can get a lot of information on this from our compost pages. But it really depends on what your goals are. But what I'll say is the best kind of compost is the kind that you can get. And really, we all need compost, but also diversity is the name of the game. So in all things gardening, diversity is the name of the game. So the more diverse your compost source is, the more diversity of microorganisms and critters are going to be able to thrive in there. But it also depends on your soil challenges. So for example, animal manures create a compost that has a little bit higher nitrogen. If you have a soil where nitrogen is limiting, you might want to use animal manures. Some of you have a personal philosophy that you don't want to use animal manures, and that's absolutely fine. You don't have to. My favorite thing to compost is autumn leaves. Autumn leaves make the most incredible, absolutely rich compost with the least amount of work. Certainly composting your vegetables and your home food scraps is a great way to get compost too. It's a little bit more work. And so some people, you know, with the activity that goes in there, it can also attract, if you live in an urban area, sometimes it can attract rats. And so people don't like to do that. So there's just so many different choices of different ways you can get compost. And again, I encourage you to reach out to your extension place. And we can, maybe Mila, we can remember to send them the compost list for Tompkins County.
Yep, I've already listed it and I've already put it in my follow-up notes, and I've already got it in the chat.
That's why I love you so much. Thank you. So,
sure. And then we had a couple questions about ground bees and stuff. We're going to hold that till later. We're going to talk about critters in the garden at a later point. So don't worry, I'm not forgetting that question. It's just coming up soon.
Okay, thanks for rolling with us, folks. There's so much information here. I would love to pause and say, go stretch and use the bathroom, but there's no time for that. So we're going to keep going. And of course, if you need to get up and go, get up and go. So, okay, so now you have made an incredible plan and you've amended, you built your beds, you've maybe added some compost, you've got some soil. We are ready to grow some plants, okay? This is the best part. And so now you're probably wondering, how do I know what things I can just plant seeds in the ground and which ones do I need transplants for? So let's talk about that. Are you going to use seeds or are you going to use transplants? Okay, so let's talk about seeds first. So seeds are way less expensive than transplants, right? So you can get a packet of lettuce seed for, you know, anywhere from $2 to $4. And in that packet is probably anywhere from 100 to 400 seeds. If you go to the nursery or the farmer's market and you buy a 6-pack of lettuce, of lettuce starts, you're probably going to pay anywhere from $3 to $6 for that, and you're going to get 6 plants. So seeds are advantageous because you get to save a ton of money. The other thing about seeds is you'll find as you start getting seed catalogs that there are way more variety available for seeds. For example, I should have looked up ahead of time how many varieties of carrots there are to plant in your garden. But I would say the answer is nearing on like 40 to 50 different varieties that you can choose from for carrots. Well, carrots was a bad example because you're never going to go buy starts. Let's go back to let's say tomatoes. So for tomatoes, we're literally talking about hundreds of varieties of tomatoes to choose from. But when you go to the nursery or the farmer's market, maybe at the outset, you're going to have 10 to 20 varieties to choose from. And depending on when you go in the season, you may just only have 2 or 3. So you have a lot more choices available when you're starting from seed. The other thing about seeds is plants that are grown directly from seeds in the ground, if they're appropriate to plant that way, are generally more hardy and more resilient. So if you think about a plant that has been grown in a greenhouse, it's been in this cushy environment where it's getting maybe fertilized every couple days and watered all the time, and the bugs picked off of it. And it's like living in a botanical spa every day, right? And it's getting this really, really pampered lifestyle. And then you're going to stick it in the ground and say, like, good luck battling Mother Nature out there. So we can end up plant transplants, depending on how they're grown, can be a little bit more wimpy, whereas, you know, these seeds are scrappy and they've started out there in Mother Nature and they've been growing and growing and doing their thing, dancing with nature for their whole life, and it's just second nature to them. So when it is appropriate, I like to use seeds instead of transplants. However, that is not appropriate for every variety of and species that's out there. Transplants have some advantages too, though. For some of our long season crops, they can get a head start. So for those of you that maybe some of you have already started growing tomatoes, this is an example of, these are some tomatoes that are growing. It's a variety called Stupička. It's from Czechoslovakia. It's one of my favorites. And for something like a tomato, you can't just put a seed in the ground when our snow melts, because that will not give a tomato long enough to grow. So we can get really a head start on the season and start planting things long before spring has come in New York State. The other thing about a transplant is it's a lot better equipped to compete with weeds, right? So once you get your soil ready, nature abhors a vacuum. So the second you get that soil ready, weed seeds are going to start to germinate. As soon as it's warm enough and wet enough, they're going to germinate like crazy. Now, if you are a new gardener especially, and you've thrown a couple of kale seeds in the ground, and then in the meantime, all around it, there's lamb's quarters coming up and all these other weeds, you may not be able to tell the difference between the kale seeds you planted and the weed seeds that are coming up. And when you go in and you try and clean up, you have a plant that either you've accidentally weeded the plants you've grown, but also those plants that you've planted, they're the same size as the weeds and they can't compete. Whereas if we stick a big old transplant in the ground and then weeds start germinating around it, one, we can tell the difference really easily. And then two, our plant already has a big head start on those weeds. So if you have a particularly really weedy site, transplants will be much better able to compete with the weeds for you. And then the other thing was kind of like I was saying, for some of these things like tomatoes and eggplants, a lot of these species that we grow in our gardens, they're from the subtropics, right? So anything that is subtropical, they want nothing to do with our spring here, and you're going to need to grow them in a greenhouse, a nice warm greenhouse, or buy them from someone who has, in order to be able to use those in your garden. And that common crop chart will tell you right there whether or not you need to be using transplants. And so that's going to be specifically help you to not make that mistake of throwing the wrong seeds in the ground. Okay, so with transplants, you know, the great news is you can grow your own, and I'm going to put a little plug in that this Wednesday night, whatever the date is there, April 1st, it's not an April Fool's joke, we are teaching a class on seed starting, and we'll teach you how to grow your own transplants. So you can join us for that, and also tell your friends, and we'll show you how to do it, not only with fancy setups of lights and all those things, but also really simple things you can use from home. You don't have to have a fancy setup in order to be able to grow some seeds in your windowsill. So transplants are something you can grow on your own. We're not going to talk about how to do that at all here. That's going to be for Wednesday night's class. And I also really want to encourage you. I know a lot of you are signed up using our Corona Solidarity pricing, which is 100% free. And you can take as many classes as you want at that pricing. We're really, really grateful to have everybody here, so don't feel shy about that. You can use recycled containers. If any of you buy like the spinach at Wegmans or like any of the stores now that sell the spinach that come in containers, those are great for starting seeds in, so you can start to save those and hoard those. What I would invite you to do, if any of you have kids or anything like that, you'll always see stuff about starting seeds in egg cartons. Please don't do that. It is not a great way for a plant to start. They just don't have enough volume for their soil for your seedlings to grow good roots. Some of you might say, oh, I've done it before, it worked fine. It may have worked fine, but it's really not ideal for your plants. So don't use egg cartons. I could go into a million more reasons not to use them, but it's really just not a great way to grow transplants. They're just too small.
Me too. It's one of my unfavorite things that I see all over the place.
Yeah.
So just don't do it.
Don't do it. Okay, so you've got some seeds, you've got your transplants. How do you know when to plant them? So the minimum soil and air temperature are really important. So you need to know, you can look at all the planting calendars. We're going to, the planting calendars that we'll send you for Tompkins County, and you can look at those. But in the end, those are just based on averages. And what's really important is how warm is your soil and how warm is your air. So one thing is just to recognize that all these planting calendars have limitations. And also you may have a site that is warmer or cooler than the average. So we call that microclimate. And you really want to know what's going on in your site. Now, there's a picture of a soil thermometer, and I will admit to, I am a nerdy enough gardener that I own a soil thermometer. You do not need to rush out and buy a soil thermometer. You don't need one. Your soil thermometer looks like this. It's your finger. And you're going to stick your finger in the ground, and if it's cold, that's too cold. If your finger feels really cold in the soil, that's too cold for almost everything. Once it feels cool on your hand, just a little bit cool, then that is good enough for your cold weather crops. And your warm weather crops, things like tomatoes, they really don't want to go in the soil until it's a solid 70 to 80 degrees in the soil. I would say 70, 75. And so, our bodies are, 90, 98-ish. And so something that is 80, almost 70 to 80 degrees it'll feel just ever so slightly cool on your finger. So your soil thermometer is not needed. But knowing when the soil and the air is warm enough. And again, if you're not sure, email or call your grow line, your hotline at your extension, and they will be happy to help you with that. Okay, so let's talk about direct seeding. So direct seeding is just a term for when we take a seed and we stick it in the ground, nothing fancy. The first thing you need to know if you're going to direct seed something is how to read your seed packet. Now, every seed packet is different, but they all are going to have most of the information you need. So if you're feeling totally perplexed, and you're like, I just wish Jennie were here and she would help me and she was going to tell me what to do, don't worry, the seed packet is going to tell you what to do for the most part. And so, for example, information that you might see on a seed packet include information about the variety. And I don't think you can, can you see my arrow as I'm moving around, Mila? No, you can't. That's fine. So you're going to see things about the variety of the seed you have.
I can see your arrow.
Oh, you can see my arrow. Okay, I'm going to point at things. Okay, so here I'm pointing at the gold nugget variety. And so you're going to know the name of your variety. Another piece of information you're going to see is the number of days from sowing until harvest. Okay, so for that variety, the number of days is listed there. I'm going to give you a cautionary tale about this. Two things. One, where you get your seed from matters. And we will send you a list of seed companies we like. We can't promote one seed company over another, but what I can tell you is who are our local seed companies or quasi-local. The more local your seed company is to you, the more likely that seed is going to grow well in your garden. So for example, this company, because is Territorial Seed Company, you'll see at the bottom, it tells you they're from Cottage Grove, Oregon, okay? So Cottage Grove, Oregon is a long way from Ithaca, New York, and the seeds that are grown there are gonna work really well in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and they may work really well here. But probably a seed that's grown in upstate New York is going to be a little bit more adapted to our crazy climate, our weird intense rains, our incredible humidity. All these things that go into creating our climate are going to work better for seed companies that are local. And I'm going to put a plug in here. We really aren't allowed to promote one seed company over another. However, the good news is we only have one seed company that is local to upstate New York. So I'm now going to tell you a list of all the seed companies that are local to upstate New York. And it's Fruition Seeds. And Fruition Seeds is all organic, local, woman-run seed company. They're based in Naples, New York, just outside of Rochester, south of Rochester. And they're really focused on regionally adapted seeds that are really specifically grown for this climate. And so I encourage that. And then we'll send you another list that has seed companies that are, again, from the Northeast growing in these other climates. You can imagine if it says there's 60 days for a pepper that's grown in California, is that pepper going to grow in 60 days in New York State? Certainly not. So the more local, the more this information on the seed packet will be relevant to your garden. And someday, when you've been gardening for a few years, you'll start saving your own seeds because those will be the seeds that are the most relevant to your garden, or get them from a friend or a neighbor and start trading seeds. That's the real power. It's Those of us who have boxes and boxes of saved seeds right now are feeling very rich in this new economy that we have. So I encourage, and there'll be a seed saving class in the late summer, and you can take that with us too. So, so you want to know the number of days till harvest. Now here's a little trickster thing. If you'll see on this tomato, it says that this is 60 days until harvest. Well, I think we all know, I already told you, tomatoes are a tropical plant. It is far more than 60 days from when a seed is planted until a tomato is harvested. The tricky thing about seed packets is, for some reason, anything that you should plant from transplant is telling you the number of days from, not from when you plant that seed, but when you plant that transplant until you can harvest. So this gold nugget is a cherry tomato. So what they're saying is 2 months, 60 days after you've planted your cherry tomato plant in the ground is about when you're going to get cherry tomatoes. So again, that number can be really variable. Sometimes you go to the nursery and you buy a plant that's so big it's already got little baby cherry tomatoes on it, right? So that's not going to be 60 days. So you really have to take these day numbers with a little grain of salt. Other things it's going to tell you on the back of the packet usually is how far apart your seeds need to be planted, how much sun the plant needs, how long it will take your plant to germinate. So that's for the seeds to sprout. That's a really important number, because sometimes we plant something, we direct seed it into the garden, and we forget, time passes, and then we realize maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, like, where are my kale? They never came up. If you know how long it takes things to germinate, you'll have a better idea of when things have had some predation in your garden. Maybe, you know, your seedlings came up on a day that you didn't go out to the garden, slugs came by, mowed them all down, and you missed the whole thing. So if you're aware, hey, this is how long something takes to germinate, I better go check in on this after 6 or 7 days and make sure things are coming up. So that's really important. Another thing it tells you sometimes, although not on all seed packets, is how deep to plant your seeds. As a general rule, the depth of the seed, the depth you want to put your seeds is whatever the biggest diameter of that seed is. So let's just imagine a pumpkin seed is something we all can get a picture of in our head. We're going to take the longest side of that pumpkin seed and we're going to go, oh, look at you go, Mila. See, look at her circling the seed depth. That's my technological guru over there. Thanks, Mila. You're gonna take that seed depth, you're gonna take that diameter, and you're gonna go 3 times that deep. So if my seed is an inch, obviously there's no seeds that are an inch, but I'm just using an inch in diameter, then we're gonna go 3 inches deep. And so you'll be going 3 times the depth. And so that's really important as well. And so you're gonna find all these. This packet actually even has on it, right next to where Mila circled, the soil temperature needed for germination. So sometimes they'll tell you how warm it needs to be. So you'll notice, oh my gosh, I'm so proud of you, Mila. Look at you go with the technology. The soil temperature for germination on a tomato is 70 to 90 degrees. So we're talking about a really warm greenhouse. Our soil is not going to hit that temperature until mid-July. So you're never going to be planting a tomato from seed. Those of you who have gardened before might notice around when our temperatures hit 70 to 90 degrees, what starts happening in your garden? Some of your volunteer tomatoes start sprouting, don't they? So eventually our temperatures will hit that, and we can germinate a tomato seed. But for some of especially our non-cherry tomatoes, we just won't have time to produce a tomato before the end of the season. So get to know your seed packets. And also all this information is in your seed catalogs. Really encourage you as a new gardener, maybe this is too much information, keep seed catalogs in the bathroom and flip through them, or keep them anywhere you tend to spend a bunch of time. I have definitely kept a seed catalog open right next to me while I'm playing Legos with my son, and I glance over every chance I get. Seed catalogs are really, really inspiring, and it's one of the best places to become a knowledgeable gardener. Okay, seeds. So now we've got our seeds. What do they need to germinate? They need moisture and they need warmth. And the absolutely critical is the moisture piece. If the seed does not have moisture, it cannot germinate. It has that seed coat, nature is genius. And so each seed has a seed coat around it. And the thing that gets that seed to be able to hang out in the ground and wait, sometimes 30, 40, 50 years to germinate is that seed coat has to imbibe water, take in water in order to germinate. And so it's the thing that stabilizes seeds so that they don't germinate when it's not time. and then they do germinate when it is time. So, and every seed needs a different amount of warmth. Now, too much moisture, of course, is a bad thing. When we have too much moisture with our seeds, they're going to rot. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is the right amount of moisture. And
Jenny, I'm going to pause you for a second. It is 12:04.
Oh my goodness, we're definitely going to 12:30, friends. Hang tight with us. So, okay, 12:04. And if anybody needs to leave, we are recording and you will get this all and you can listen. We so appreciate you bearing with us. When we planned to do this class in person, it was going to be a 3-hour class. So now we're squishing it. And I'm hoping you're all grateful that we have all this time for questions. Okay, so germination requirements. So basically, this is a long story short. This is in your common crop chart. Everybody has a different requirement for germination. So you'll notice onions can germinate at 34 to 36 degrees. So just after the soil is basically unfrozen. That doesn't mean they're going to thrive then. It just means that they could germinate. So do I think that the second that your soil unfreezes, you should go out and stick pea seeds in the ground? I don't think so. They're probably going to rot and slugs are going to eat them. I like to wait till things warm up. But so, yeah, these are just minimums. So we'll keep going. Okay, sowing patterns. So when you're sowing seeds, you have a lot of choices about the ways you can do it. Some of us like to make rows and some of us don't. One thing I'll tell you is if you think you can make a straight row without drawing a straight line first with something that's actually straight, guess what? You're wrong. You can't do it. No one can do it. I don't know why, but it can't be done. You really need to take a tool and make a straight line. Some of us even like to use 2 stakes at the end of a row and tie a string between them to make a perfectly straight line. But draw a row that's the right depth for your seed, either with a finger or a tool, and place the seeds one by one at the right distance apart. Again,
and I know there are some people out there who are like, oh, straight lines. I like my garden to be kind of wild and organic. And what I'm going to suggest is if you're a beginner, go ahead and start with a straight line. Or start with a line. If the line can be, you know, a triangle of lines. But if you have your seeds growing in some sort of very obvious geometric pattern, a line or a triangle or whatever, it'll be really easy for you to determine what's an intentional plant and what's a weed.
Yep.
If you kind of sprinkle stuff around, you're going to have to do a little bit of investigation when all this stuff starts to grow to figure out what was here intentionally and what was here because there was a weed seed in the ground. I'm going to suggest for your first gardens, go ahead and make a row. It'll make things so much easier and less confusing later on.
And always sow a little bit more than you need. Things happen to seeds, critters eat them, birds eat them, things don't come up. It's better to plant a little extra and have to thin your plants than to have big gaps in between your plants and have nothing to put there. You can also do something called banded planting. So these are a little bit wider rows. So you'll see here we have some onions in the picture, and in between them, we have a band of beets. Now those beets are just thrown a whole bunch of seeds into a 6-inch area, and then you would go in later and thin those out. So some things that I like to do in banded plantings, I like to do beets, carrots, cilantro, fresh herbs, dill, anything like that. And I just sow a whole bunch of them and then I thin them out later. The thing that you want to be mindful of is it's a little bit harder to weed in there. And so you got to watch out for that. And you want to kind of get out there as soon as those things germinate while you can still see down in there and pull out the weeds, things that look different. And this is a great way to just get something planted and not worry too much about it, but you will need to do some weeding. It's not the most efficient use of your seed. You're going to have to thin things out a little bit more, but seed is relatively cheap. And so I sometimes will do banded planting for certain crops.
And I love doing that kind of thing if it's a crop that you can eat the baby leaves of.
Yeah.
So if you're putting in chard, if you're putting in beets, if you're putting in like greens or lettuces, go ahead and do banded because you're going to thin those plants out. But the plants that you thin, you can actually put in your salad. So enjoy.
Okay, and then another thing we like to do is called hill planting. And hill planting is a technique, you know, and I didn't start off by saying this, but I do want to acknowledge that every single thing we're teaching you here today, every concept we teach you is something that has been developed over time for thousands of years by indigenous populations. And a lot of us are learning this stuff from books that are written recently, generally by, North American white men. And they've been doing, those men have all done great work. But I just really want to acknowledge all of these techniques we're teaching you have been time tested for thousands of years by indigenous populations from all over the world. So I specifically say that as I see hill planting, because the Haudenosaunee people that lived on the land that we're teaching to you here from and still do live here, hill planting is something that they pioneered back with the Three Sisters crops. And so we really want to pay some respect to all that and just gratefulness for all this knowledge that has been shared through the generations. So hill planting is just where you have groups of several seeds, either in the same hole or on the same mound. I don't usually put them in the same hole. I do more like you see in the picture. And you're just going to put down some seeds and cover them up, and then you can thin down to the strongest seedlings. So for example, right here where you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those look like either melon or squash plants on the same mound. After those start to develop their true leaves, I would thin this down to 1 or at the most 2 seedlings, and I'd pull out the weakest ones. Hill planting is a great way to also do multiple things in the same place. So the Three Sisters planting system that we have from the Haudenosaunee people, we have corn, beans, and squash. That works best when it's done on a hill. So we would have corn in the middle, and then 3 or 4 ears of corn, beans climbing up that, and then a squash plant growing around the bottom. Okay, so you've got your seeds. You've figured out based on your common crop chart which ones you're going to direct seed. And in fact, for those of you who really like to be organized about it, when I've got all my seeds and they're arriving, one of the things I do is I divide them into different piles. I have a pile of seed packets that are things that are going to get direct seeded in the spring and or in the cool season, and then a pile of things that are going to be direct seeded in the warm season. And then I have things that need to be transplanted. So you can literally pick up that pile of things that are direct seeded in the spring, and that common crop chart will help you sort those things out. The other thing that I'll say about seeds, since we've been sitting here talking about seeds, is some of you may already have seeds. And for those of you who don't and are able to afford to support the seed companies right now, go and place your seed order as soon as you can if you haven't already. Everybody, just like all of you, everybody's interest in gardening is skyrocketing, and we're so thrilled about that. And the seed companies' orders they're getting backed up, so they're taking a little longer to arrive right now, just like with anything else that's essential in this time. So get your seed order together and send that out as soon as you can, and hopefully you'll have it in a week or two. And don't worry, don't fret too much. You still have lots of time before you need to be putting things in the ground. So you're not going to run out of time if you haven't had a seed order yet. Some of you may also be wondering about, we have the free seed cabinet here at CC Tompkins. Knowing that all of this quarantine was coming soon, Mila put together an incredible effort to get all our seeds given away. And so our free seed cabinet is now closed down for the season. We have requested more seeds from different seed companies, but it could be a while before they come here. So really encourage you, if you're able, to go and order seeds and support the seed companies. Also, some of our grocery stores, if you are still heading out to the grocery store, of course, we encourage you to stay home. But if you're heading out to the grocery store, a lot of them have seeds there. Okay, so now you've got your seeds. Now we're going to talk about things that are going to be transplanted. So choosing a healthy transplant. So you see here, there's a transplant on your left that's a little bit taller, and a transplant on your right that is a little bit shorter. So you don't have to type this into the chat box or anything, but just think to yourself for a moment, which one, if you go to the nursery, which one of these are you going to choose to bring home? The one on the left that's taller, or the one on the right that's shorter? And this isn't really a trick question, but it is a little bit. So if I'm going to the nursery, I'm going to choose the plant on the right, the shorter one. And I'll tell you why. Shorter is not the reason why. The reason I'm going to choose that plant is it looks brighter green. It is stout. So if you look at the stem and look how thick that stem is, it's pretty thick. And so, tall and thin is maybe hip in Cosmo magazine, but short and stout is the winning combination when you're a plant or a gardener. Yes. Um, and so what we want are plants that are burly. Think burly. You want something that's going to go out there and be resilient. So it's very tempting when you go to the nursery to pick the tallest, biggest one. I really encourage you to be looking for things that are deep, dark green, thick stems, and leaves that are like, see how these leaves on the right plant, they're kind of overlapping and compact. The other thing you want to look at, which neither of these plants has a problem, is you want to make sure that the plant is not root bound. So root bound just means that the roots of the plant have gotten so crowded in the pot that they've started swirling around the inside of the pot because they have no place to go. So root bound is not great. These are all things we can deal with, but in general, we want ample root development without the roots starting to swirl around. And you can feel for that just by squeezing the plant in its pot. It's kind of like squeezing a melon at the store. If you squeeze and there's just like a ton of resistance, that is root bound. If you squeeze and there's no resistance, that means it's got poor root development. We want somewhere in the middle where you squeeze and it feels a little bit of resistance. Okay, so you've got your starts. Again, spacing is critical. We're going to make sure that we have enough space based on that common crop chart between things. Now, as you become a more advanced gardener, or maybe as you're going to experiment, when you have plants like this, where you've got all this empty space, you can actually do something called interplanting or companion planting, where we actually might plant something that grows really quickly in between two plants that grow really slowly in order to utilize that space. So you could, for example, put a lettuce seedling in between your tomatoes or your broccoli plants. And by the time that lettuce is ready to harvest, those broccoli or tomato plants will be getting so big that they'll cover up that space. That's a little bit more advanced technique. We teach a whole class on interplanting and companion planting, but it is a technique you can try out and read more about. Okay, we're gonna skip the pause. Sorry guys, we don't have time, but we'll get to questions at the end. Okay, vertical gardening. So we've got our seeds, we've got our transplants, we've put things in the ground. Some of you are gonna be really limited on space. So we wanna talk about making things grow up and not necessarily out. This is a really cool thing to do. It also looks super cool in your garden. This is really brief. There are so many ways to make a trellis, and I love this picture because it shows how you don't have to go to the garden store and buy something fancy. You can use old bicycle tires or bed frames or sticks and twine, all sorts of ways for you to get really creative. I've seen old tennis rackets used as trellises. I've seen, you name it, there's something fun. This could be a great project if your kids are home and getting a little crazy in the quarantine. Create some sort of cool trellis. This is a really fun thing to do. Not all plants can be trellised, but anything that's getting long and leggy, so squashes, beans, tomatoes, what am I forgetting? Peas are great things to trellis. Okay, so I've got this making your map here, so we're going to talk about making a map really briefly. And again, we can do a whole class on mapping your garden, but what I would encourage you to do, if nothing else, is to make the most rudimentary. It can be back of the napkin, or you can make, Picasso level work of art, but please at least make a minor sketch of your map. You may be thinking, don't worry, I will remember where I put everything. You won't. I've said that so many times that I've got it, I'll remember next year. It's really, really just not possible. I don't know why. It's like our brains get scrambled over the winter. So please map your garden. Really also encourage a garden journal where you keep notes about varieties and all sorts of amendments that you've put in, notes that you make. Oh, I planted this variety of cucumbers, and then you can look back later and be like, we tried that cucumber and it was bitter, and you can keep really great notes. Again, a garden journal can be an incredible work of art, or it can be like the most scribbled thing on the back of paper. It can be an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Doc. You can go, again, let your personality guide that, and there's no right way to do it, but I encourage you to do it. And with all of this, I would say don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So you may want to make, again, this work of art, or you're like, start writing things down in March. Everybody who's keeps garden journals, not everybody, but I'll say 90% of us, and keep incredible notes in March, April, and May. And then in June and July and August, it gets a little less frequent and we get so busy in the garden that doesn't mean you should stop journaling and you're doing your garden journal just because you haven't done it perfectly. Just get down what you can, and all that information will be there and available to you in the future, and it will make you a better gardener if you're keeping those notes.
And for those of you who are, electronic users, there are plenty of apps that you can keep a garden journal on your phone. I have a Facebook page that's just for my garden, and I just snap pictures, and that way I can actually scroll through the pictures, and it'll show me memories from last year, so I can see exactly like what that thing was that bloomed on June 2nd last year. So just use whatever style works for you, but keep good notes. It's incredibly helpful. Even if you end up keeping like last year's seed catalog with circles over the things that you ordered, that's a really great way to keep a record of what you have from year to year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could do a whole class on garden journaling. There's so many ways to keep records. And Mila said keep good notes. I would encourage you, yes, keep good notes, but also just keep bad notes if that's all you can do. Just take some notes, and you'll get better and better at that year after year. But definitely don't let perfection stand in your way. And I'm saying that as someone who's definitely let perfection stand in the way of her doing that. So just don't let that happen to you. Okay, so map out your planting area. Again, I'm going to encourage you to make a map. Does it have to be perfect and to scale? No. But the farther you go into that perfection and to scale, the better off more useful it's going to be for you. So it is an example right here of somebody's got a map of their garden. Things you want to include on your map are a north arrow is really nice to have so you can know which direction your sunlight is coming from. Big structures that can provide shade, like these tall bushes or the house, are important. You also really want to put your sources of water, your water spigots, on your map. It can be really helpful. And then just measuring out your planting space. And again, you can sketch this in a sketchbook. You can put it on graph paper. There are ways to make maps in Excel. There are garden making apps. This is a great project for kids. So many choices. And as you're filling in your map, just again, keep thinking about plant spacing. So as you do that map, you're going to be noticing, probably you're going to do your mapping while you're planting your seeds or right before. So keep track of how big things are going to get. And this is a perfect example of a very simple plant map that it doesn't take a long time to create. And yet it's going to be extraordinarily effective for planting. And one thing that's really nice about mapping is not only are you thinking about footprint and height and crop rotation, but we're going to mention that concept we talked about earlier called succession planting. So succession planting is basically planting one thing after another thing. So sometimes that thing you're going to plant after another thing is the same thing. So for example, we plant some lettuce, we harvest that lettuce, and then we plant more lettuce. Or sometimes it's going to be a new thing. So let's see if the next slide, oh no, it doesn't show it. So I'm going to explain it. So for example, spinach is a great example of something that grows really quickly, right? You're just eating the leaves, and it doesn't grow well in the summer. So you might have a map that has you might create a base map and have one map that says spring and one that says summer and one that says fall. And there's certain things on your map, they're gonna stay there the whole time. For example, if you look up in this top corner, the top of the map here, it says curly parsley. Curly parsley is something you're going to plant it in the spring. It's going to stay there all summer. It's going to stay there in the fall. That parsley and the chives that are right next to it will be on all three versions. Whereas the spinach and the peas and the cilantro, those are things you're going to harvest, and you'll get a chance to plant something new there after they've been harvested. So for example, after I've harvested my spinach, that might be where I put my tomatoes or my green beans, something that needs to come out, that needs to wait until summertime in order to get planted. So you can have a separate map for spring and summer and fall and be thinking about these successions. Okay, sorry guys, no pause. This is what we're doing. Let's get to watering. Now, you might think this is actually one of the biggest sections, and you might think it's just watering. I will tell you right now that the number one mistake that gardeners get wrong, as far as I'm concerned, beginning gardeners, is the watering. And of course, these are plants and the watering is critical. So we are going to go through some watering techniques way faster than you want me to because of the time, but that's what we're doing. Okay, so watering. In dry periods, we need to provide water. We want watering to be deep and infrequent, okay? So we're going to be, a lot of you are thinking, I'm watering my plants, I go out there and I water them every day. If you have to water your plants every day, you are not watering them deep enough. in general, depending on how your dry site is, and if any of you are chiming in from Oregon, this slide will not apply to you because you guys probably need to water every day. It doesn't rain and it's not humid in summer in Oregon. But in general, in upstate New York, we want to be watering 2 to 3 times a week. And that depends a lot on your soil type. You want to water so deep that that moisture is going to hold on for 2 to 3 days. And we're going to get some images about what that looks like. And now some of you might think, well, it rains here in the summer, Jen. How do I know if the rain was enough? I will say, unless it's a giant rainstorm, it probably wasn't enough. We'll talk about that, how you know. Okay, so some of you mentioned you have different kinds of soil: sandy soil, clay soil, and loamy soil. Loamy is just a midpoint between sand and clay, more or less. It has a lot of different particle size in it. They all absorb water differently. So you can see on the left there, we have a clay soil. And not only do we have a clay soil, you'll see that little stripe at the top. That's a compacted layer on our clay soil. So we have super tight clay there. That water can't even penetrate to get down into this clay soil. Whereas on the right, we have soil that has nice air spaces and pore spaces. That soil can store a lot more water, okay? So having good soil is gonna make your watering easier. This part might go without saying, but put your water where it's needed. Water at the roots. A lot of times we see people watering at the top of their plant. Especially on a hot, sunny day, actually that water, the reflective capacity of water, you can actually end up burning your plants by having water droplets just sitting on their leaves in a really hot, sunny day. So direct the water right to the roots of the plants. You're not sure if you need to water, go in and spot check. Stick your finger in the ground, and you want to stick your finger in the ground not just at the very surface, but way down deep where the roots of the plants would be. What you want it to feel like is a wrung out sponge. So not like you can see the picture up there in the corner of a sponge. You want it to feel, wet and moist without having any, if you were to squeeze it, no water would come out, right? And so that's the ideal of how it would feel after you've watered. So we're going to talk about 3 different watering methods. The first is hand watering. The nice thing about hand watering is there's really low waste. You can really customize for each kind of plant how much water you're giving. It's super low cost. All you need is a watering can or a hose and a little end piece. But it takes a ton of time. If you have a big garden, hand watering may not be for you. Or yeah, that's sort of the biggest thing. The other thing can be annoying about hand watering is if you have a really far distance between your location of your hose and your garden, or things like that. So, but that is the easiest one. And certainly if you have a nice small garden, hand watering is the way to go. I will be honest with you, I have a gigantic garden and I still do some hand watering. And one of the things I love about hand watering is I get to spend time with my plants. And as I'm watering, I really just hang out there. I'm taking care of the plants. I'm having actual physical contact with the plants. And there's something that is so potent about that relationship that we develop with our gardens and with our plants. And so I would say one of my favorite times a day is when I'm watering. I realize I also don't have a slide about when to water. Ideally, you would be watering first thing in the morning. In fact, if you wanted to be really ideal, you'd set your alarm for like just before sunrise to go water. I'm not expecting you to do that, although it is an absolutely fantastic time to go listen to bird songs and be in your garden. And that's because at that time of day, we're going to have the least amount of evaporation happening, but also the water is not just, if you were to water at night, for example, the water is just sitting there all night when the plants aren't growing. So we're providing the water to the plants early in the morning, right before they're about to do their burst of growing while it's nice and cool. And we also don't have to worry about burning the leaves of our plants. So I encourage you to do that. Get to know your plants. I sing to my plants while I'm watering. I swear it helps them grow, or it at least helps me be more patient while I'm hand watering. Okay, so how long do you water for? You want to water, I've heard a couple of different ways. You want to water, this set shows, until your soil stays shiny for 10 to 15 seconds. When I'm watering, I actually go based on sound. And what I'm listening for when I'm watering is the sound of water hitting water. And you'll recognize that sound as soon as you hear it. So there's a sound of water hitting soil. While your water is hitting soil, that means your soil is still not saturated. As soon as I hear water hitting water, I stop. So that means we've now had water pool on the top. Now, if you have a really, really nasty clay soil, you might not want to wait for water hitting water because you're not going to get good percolation and drainage into the soil. But assuming you've used all our really great soil building techniques we've taught you, you're going to have really great pore space in your soil. When you hear water hitting water, that water is still going to be going down in your soil column, and you'll have a chance to actually even water a little bit more after. So when I'm watering, I go to water hitting water, then I'll go to a new location and water while that soil's percolating down. And then I actually go back to that same location and I go till I've heard water hitting water 3 times. So I let it percolate down, and then I come back and do water hitting water, and then I go to another bed, and then I come back a 3rd time. And if you want to get really scientific about it, stick your finger, do until you hear water hitting water, then stick your finger down deep in the soil and see how far down that water has actually gone. I think what you'll find is it hasn't gone very far yet. And then come back and stick your finger in again after that 2nd time. So really start to learn, how does my soil respond to these different techniques, and really become a scientist in your own garden. Some of us don't have money to be buying all this watering stuff, no problem. Here's an empty milk jug, poke some holes in the top and make your own watering can. Lots of different ways we can save money. Gardening doesn't have to be something that's expensive. Okay, second thing, now speaking of things that are expensive, the second option for us is called drip irrigation. This is very low water waste. So if you have issues with water supply, you don't have a lot of water, you're going to want to look into drip irrigation. This is something where we're not going to go into the technicality of this at all. This is not necessarily a beginning gardener thing, although most of you are probably familiar with soaker hoses. That's sort of a basic way to do drip irrigation. This is really good for low water situations, or also high heat exposure where you're going to have a lot of evaporative loss of your water. But this is complicated and it costs money, so it's not for most of us. And here's just an example of how you might use a soaker hose in your garden. The last one is sprinklers. So sprinklers are a lot less work. They do, however, waste a bunch of water. So if you have water supply issues, sprinklers may not be for you. And then the only other minus about sprinklers is it gets water on your leaves. So that can be problematic for a number of reasons. The first being what we talked about with burning the leaves, but also if you do have too much humidity and moisture and water on the leaves, this can invite in pathogens. And so there are a lot of plants, and tomatoes is a great example of something that really does not thrive as well with water on their leaves. So when I'm watering my tomatoes, I tend to hand water them if I'm not using drip irrigation, just to avoid getting water on the leaves. But for a lot of us, a sprinkler is going to be our best bet. How often to water really depends on your soil and what plants you're growing and the weather. Some things are super tolerant to drying out. So tomatoes and peppers are a great example. They come from hot climates, and they're totally fine with a little bit of dry soil for a few days. Other things, there are some things that are just total water hogs. So celery is a great example. You don't see a lot of locally grown celery. It takes a ton of water. Melons are another thing that take a ton of water. If you don't have a ton of water, you might start to look at, even just Googling what vegetables are more drought tolerant. And so you can find out some things taste great, even better when you water them less. In fact, one thing we do is when tomatoes are getting close to harvest, we stop watering them because you guys have all probably had a watered down tomato from the grocery store. They don't even taste like tomatoes. We want our tomatoes to be sweet and potent. And one of the ways we get that is by stressing them out a little bit with a little bit of drought. So the good news is your plants have a built-in mechanism to remind you to water. They will wilt when you haven't watered them. Don't worry, when your plant wilts like this, you have not killed it. It's kind of amazing to watch it perk right back up. The wilting is actually a water conservation technique. So they're purposefully, the cells are purposefully doing this to resist not bursting, basically when the cell walls dry out. However, don't wait till your plants wilt to water them. You really want to water them right before they would have wilted. So this involves a little bit of getting to know your plants. But certainly if you have a wilty plant, you want to get some water on it ASAP. If you have
one side note about this is that every once in a blue moon we'll have a really super set of hot days.
Yes. Oh, good.
And your plants are going to look wilty, and you're going to go out and water them, and they're still going to look wilting. And it's because over a certain temperature, your plants are basically closing the stomates on the bottom to to reduce loss of moisture. So it doesn't matter how much you water on a really like a 98-degree day, it's still going to look a little wilty. It's okay. Your plant will bounce back as soon as the temperatures regulate a little bit.
Yep, absolutely. And also on that very hot, wilty day, that's a day to be really conscious of. When your plant looks like this, try not to get water on the leaves. Take that water straight to the roots of your plants. And sometimes when my plants are this wilty and it's that hot, I really wait until the sun starts going down to even go give them that dose of water, just because of what Mila was talking about. Because if it is really that hot, the plants aren't going to be able to take up the water, but it will still evaporate from your soil. So you might as well wait until it cools down. And also that way you can keep yourself out of that hot sun too. Okay, different plants have different watering needs. Seedlings need to be kept moist. They need to be watered every 2 days, every 1 to 2 days, and they need to be gentle. And these seeds that you see here are carrot seedlings. Carrots are notoriously hard to germinate because they will not tolerate it drying out at all. So with my carrot seedlings, I'll be honest, I probably water them twice a day. I mean, I would probably camp out next to them if I could orchestrate my life around them, because if you dry out a carrot seedling, it'll be dead before you notice. Growing plants have, so seedlings have different needs than growing plants, and a growing plant has a different need based on how big it is. So for example, a giant full-grown tomato plant needs water than a small plant. Just think about a kid that's growing and needing different amounts of food. So big plants need more water. Also, some plants are shallow rooted and some plants are deep rooted. So deep-rooted plants can tap into a water table that's very, very deep down. They don't tend to need to be watered quite as often as shallow-rooted plants that are only getting their roots into that surface of the soil. That surface of the soil dries out much quicker in the sun. Those things need to be watered a lot more often. And again, you'll get to know these as you're gardening. You'll get to know who needs what. So for growing plants, we want to water them deep and infrequently for root growth. When we water too shallow, plants are so smart and they're so efficient. So what they're going to do is, if you always have water at the soil surface, they're going to basically say, why would I bother growing deep roots? I don't need to expend all that energy to get water. I can just get it right from the soil surface. So we want to do infrequent watering so that we encourage the roots to grow deep. That's going to help us with saving water, but it's also going to improve the stability of the soil and their ability to get mineral nutrition. So you want to water so that your water is going down at least 6 inches with your growing plants. And then for shallow-rooted plants, they're only getting water from the top 12 inches of the soil. They really, really need to be getting watered more often. So you can see on the left here, we've got some bok choy. It's very shallow-rooted. Beets are a little more deep-rooted. And then we have this tomato plant. And that is really, really, really deep-rooted. So deep-rooted plants, they can draw water from even 2 or 3, or in some cases, 8 feet down in the soil. So we want to water them really deeply when we water, but a lot less often. Okay, common watering problems. The thing we see the most is people watering too often and not deep enough. You want to be watering deep and infrequent. But another problem is overwatering. Some people are like, oh, plants need water, I'm just going to give them tons of water. If you're watering too much, giving them too much water, you're going to create conditions for diseases to proliferate. So that happy medium of what I like to think of is getting it wet like that sponge, that wrung out sponge, and then in between that, I'm going to let it dry out almost all the way without going all the way until I wet it again. Another problem is people wait too long to water. When you wait too long to water, you can develop cracking in your soil like you see here. And again, sorry guys, no time for questions, but we'll get there at the end. So we're almost to the end, by the way. So a little bit of deal here, plant nutrition. So your plants need some food. But as a beginning gardener, I really don't want you to worry about anything except for nitrogen. So when you're a beginning gardener, it can get really complicated with understanding plant nutrition. And most plants, the limiting factor for them in their nutrition is nitrogen. So here's the only one you're going to worry about. If you're adding adequate compost, you'll almost always have enough nitrogen, except for maybe on a couple things. And in this picture here, you see corn. Corn is the biggest nitrogen sucker in your garden. Probably corn and garlic are the 2 biggest. Signs that your plant needs nitrogen are pale green or yellowish leaves. You can see how this one is yellow toward the inside, but if you see yellow, pretty deep yellow, that's usually a sign that your plant needs some nitrogen. Also, what you'll notice is after you plant something, the growth will slow down dramatically after a month. That's again a sign that you don't have enough nitrogen. So it was doing fine. If you have a plant that looks like this, or it's just not growing right and you're not sure, email our grow line. Again, it's growline1@gmail.com. Send them a picture and they'll tell you what's wrong. Maybe it's not nitrogen. But our master gardeners are staffing that grow line every day from 9 to 3. And they love these questions. There are plant detectives, and they're very good at what they do. For dealing with plant nutrition, one thing I like to do if something is turning a little bit yellow is I will actually add some more compost, especially if I have some nice rich compost. We do what's called top dressing, and top dressing is just a fancy word for putting compost on the ground right next to the plant. We call it top dressing. We call it side dressing sometimes. It's just adding a little compost to it.
We asked a little earlier about using worm compost or using their finished compost.
Mm-hmm.
Worm compost, any of your finished compost, use it like this.
Yes. Yep. And then another option is to have some organic fertilizer around. And my preference is I use a liquid fish and kelp organic fertilizer. I just mix it with the water and I water things that take a lot of nitrogen. I generally don't use it on anything except for things that take a lot of nitrogen, or maybe right after I plant my seedlings. Again, this is a little bit more of an advanced technique. You don't need to do it. Also, please, if you spend money on organic fertilizers, read the directions and apply them as directed. You can waste a lot of money and a lot of resources. Remember, all these things are coming out of the earth. Sometimes they've come from animals, and we just like to use them really, really efficiently. So read the directions and apply them as directed. Well, no more questions. Okay, weeds. So gardening is basically two things: planting and then weeding, right? Planting and taking care of plants and then trying to kill other plants. We could have a long conversation about what is a weed anyway. Some of the things that some of us consider weeds, the rest of us want to eat. So here's a picture of a dandelion. Dandelions are, sort of the classic weed. Well, they're also an incredible edible and medicinal plant. And they're also wonderful for bees and butterflies. So is a dandelion a weed? There are a lot of things that are going to grow in your garden that you may think of as a weed that are edible. Fruition Seeds has a great thing on their website about edible weeds. So lamb's quarters is a great example of something a lot of us have growing in our garden. Well, lamb's quarters is cousins with spinach, and it tastes just as good. So do you want the lamb's quarters theirs or not? A lot of that is personal preference. Okay. Here's what I'll say about weeding, and this is, look at this cute little sweetheart of a girl, and I'm using her about weeding, but 1 year's seeding, 7 years weeding. So when you let weed seeds go down the ground, you are creating for yourself so much work that's going to last for years and years and years. Really, the best thing we can do is control weeds early and not let them go to seed. So what I want you to know, if your garden gets taken over by weeds, that does not mean you're a bad gardener. That just means you're a gardener. This is going to happen to all of you. Your garden, at some point, you're going to be like, oh my God, why are there so many weeds? And that is universal. And so there are some of us that are more meticulous about weeding our gardens, but every gardener usually around mid to late July is complaining and overwhelmed by their weeds. So we're going to talk to you about some techniques for dealing with that. One of them is bare soil is the enemy of the gardener, okay, for so many reasons that we don't have time to go into. But the first thing is, any place you have bare soil, a weed is going to germinate. It will happen. There's just no chance. So every spot in your garden, ideally, is either covered by a plant that you planted there, or something else that is making it so that weed seeds can't land on your soil or grow up from the ones that are stored in your soil. So adding straw, leaves, compost, newspaper, cardboard. Some people use wood chips. There's some questions about that, which we don't have time to go into. But some people even use plastic in their paths. Anything that you can control weeds with by covering your soil is prevention, right? Some people do use plastic mulch. This can be costly, but it is pretty much a sure thing. We like to discourage the use of plastic as much as we can, but also understand sometimes plastic is one of the necessary evils in gardening, and there are ways around that, but some people do like to use a plastic mulch. And the one place plastic mulch is really helpful is to grow heat-loving crops. It will heat up your soil, so this is a picture of a cantaloupe plant, and cantaloupe needs a ton of heat. And in our climate, it does do best if you have a little plastic mulch around it. You can even, if you have garbage bags that have ripped, this is a great use for them. Another thing for controlling weeds has to do with water management. Oh, I'm going to go back one. So remember, every time you water your soil, you're not just watering the plants you've planted, you're watering any seed and any plant that's in there. So by confining your water just to the places where your plants are growing, this is one of the advantages of drip irrigation. You're now not spending a bunch of water watering the weeds. So that's one piece of it. Close spacing in your garden. I love this picture. You can see how in this garden, they have done such a good job with spacing. They really don't have, you can see a few spots where you can see bare soil, but they really have almost no bare soil. So now all their garden plants are shading out any weed seeds that germinate. They're getting shaded immediately by the garden plants, and weed seeds that are blowing in through the air basically have no place to go. So really focusing on not having your plants too close together that they're competing with each other. So remember, we talked about the canopies just touching each other. These guys have done a great job of that here in their lettuce, but also not leaving any space where there's bare soil. So this is a great way to control weeds. Mowing. So if you have a grass path around your garden beds, keeping that well mowed, those little critters, not critters, but plants in your grass can create seeds, and they can just shoot right into your garden. Also, the little runners from your grass can go in there. And so just by staying on top of your mowing, you can be really reducing weeding needed in the garden. If you have a really weedy site, we already talked about this, but using transplants allows you to get in there and weed a little bit more easily because you're not trying to work around your teeny tiny seedlings. Okay, and then the last thing is cultivation. So, in a farm field, this is done with a tractor, but in our case, we can use garden tools to cultivate the soil. And when we say cultivate, we basically mean just disturbing those top couple inches of the soil around where we've planted our plants. So you can see in this picture, just to the left of her lettuce seedlings, it looks like she's got lettuce and leeks, and in between there, she's gone through with a hoe and she's scraped up all the little germinating seedlings and cultivated that soil in order to rip those little seedlings out of the ground. The other thing I'll say for you is weeding is incredible stress relief. We kind of have a joke in my family that if you come home and you see like these giant piles of weeds everywhere and my garden is spotless, you should ask me what is wrong, because I've gone out and I've dealt with all my things by weeding. And so weeding is such a meditative, mindful, quiet activity, and it's absolutely incredible stress relief. So I think some of us can get stressed out by weeds, but I really try and flip that narrative on its head and think of weeding as an invitation into my garden meditation. Okay, so let's just talk about weeding tools really quick. Again, your fingers are a great weeding tool. You can just take your hand, make a little claw, and scrape it in the soil. You don't have to go out and buy weeding tools. However, you can often go to thrift stores, not right now, don't go anywhere right now, but when this is all over, you can go to thrift stores and Salvation Army, other kinds of everything. Yard sales are great places to get garden tools. Talk to your neighbors. A lot of people have, inherited all their great-grandfather's tools and aren't using them and would love to share them with you. Hand tools are a great start. Down in the bottom right corner, I love this tool. It's a Korean hand hoe, and it is an incredible weeding tool. Probably some of you have seen this one on the left before. Those are really good. I don't even know what they're called, but they're really good for deep-rooted things.
It's just called a weeder.
Just a weeder. It's called a weeder. Clever name. I actually don't have a picture here of my favorite garden tool. Is a Japanese tool called a hori knife, Hori. If you are a friend of mine, you've probably received one as a gift before because I love them so much. And that's a great tool for a lot of reasons. And you can get them actually pretty low cost, probably under $10 for some. And then if you get fancy, you can get fancy stainless steel ones. They get a lot more expensive. But having a garden hoe around to be able to weed with is pretty nice. Again, super easy to find at a yard sale. And so you don't have to spend a lot of money. Okay, one thing to know about your weeds, sometimes it's tempting to pull weeds and just like throw them to another corner of the garden. Sometimes that's fine, but some weeds can resprout really easily just from a little small tiny piece of stem or the root. If you live in an urban area, you can put these in your compost, okay? Or just making sure that you're not inadvertently tossing weeds around your own garden. And so you can see in this, so many weeds, so little time in this little garden. Let's talk about weeding triage. So in that moment you get to in July, where you're like, oh my God, I hate gardening. There's so many weeds and I'm never going to get ahead. That's going to happen. Hopefully you won't say you hate gardening. So you're going to do triage. So what's going to happen? The first thing you're going to do is you're going to pull weeds. You're going to go pull anything that's already starting to make seeds. That's the emergency. Nobody's going to make seeds. So rule number 1, go get the weeds going to seed. The next one you're going to do is you're going to look for things that are really invasive, and you'll get to know these with time. Bindweed is a great example. This is a picture of bindweed. Canada thistle is another one, getting really invasive. So you're going to pull the most invasive ones. Quackgrass, you can see that little white root sticking out of the corner of the quackgrass. Quackgrass can travel across your garden really quickly and can get really hard to pull. So that's step 2. So things going to seed, and then super invasive things. And then when you're done with all that, you're going to get everything else. And if you don't get to the other things, then you'll be sort of repeating this pattern. You'll just be focused on the things that are going to seed. Okay, no pausing. It's our last section, pest management. And there's not a lot to say here because honestly, beginning gardeners, your focus is going to be on prevention. All gardeners have pests sometimes. And what I want to invite you into, especially as an organic gardener, is to develop a tolerance for pests. That is sort of the easiest way to deal with pests. So somebody asked me once, do you have bunnies in your garden? I said, I do. I have rabbits in my garden. They're like, great. How do you deal with the bunnies? I say, I plant enough vegetables for both of us. And that's because it's too much work to try and keep the bunnies out. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to plant enough food. That doesn't always work out. Every once in a while, you're going to have something like a woodchuck that's going to come through and destroy everything, and you're going to be heartbroken. But a lot of our pests are things that we can live with. Certainly, if you have deer, you just need a fence. You just need a fence if you have deer, and you probably need it.
Hold on. If you have deer, as one of the resources we'll send you, there are a bunch of things that you can grow that are edibles that deer will stay away from. So, for instance, I have a big front yard garden. The deer walk through it. And I grow a ton of food in there. Yep. So I will send you resources about that afterwards.
Yes, thank you so much, Mila. We have a whole list of things that will, the deer won't mind at all. Okay, so IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. Integrated Pest Management is a really important concept in gardening. And the idea is that we're going to prevent pests before they can take hold. So the key to integrated pest management is prevention. And the way that we do that is the first thing we're going to do, and you all know, an ounce of prevention, I don't even need to finish that sentence for you, is we're going to focus on not having pest problems to begin with. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have any, but that's where we're going to start. So remember earlier I talked about not getting the plants that are already suffering and sticking them in the ground. Focus on choosing healthy plants, and growing healthy plants. Always start with healthy plants. That's key, right? We all know that in coronavirus right now, those of us that are vulnerable are the ones that are least healthy, and that's the same thing in your garden. Choose disease-resistant plant varieties. So there are wonderful plant breeding efforts that are happening in the organic gardening movement to breed plants that are resistant to diseases. So for the person who mentioned before that they have tomato blight in their garden every year, we have a list of blight-resistant tomatoes, and every year there are new varieties. And I know a lot of you can be nervous about GMOs. This is totally different. These are not genetically modified organisms. This is just plant breeding, where we take one plant that's really resistant to a disease and we cross that with another plant that tastes delicious just by using a little paintbrush to take pollen from one to another, and then we select the most delicious ones. And so with plant breeding, you can have organic plant breeding that leads to disease-resistant plant varieties. And a lot of our seed companies are really committed to that now. So you can get varieties that are disease-resistant. Rule out other causes for your garden problems. Sometimes you think you've got a pest or you've got a disease issue, but maybe you have a toddler issue, or you have a cat that's digging things up, or whatever it is. So keep your eyes out for other challenges. And then another piece is to just develop a tolerance level for damage. So is this kale leaf still edible? 100%. You're not a farmer going to sell your produce at the grocery store. You don't need to worry about this. I don't worry about certain pests because I think that the plant is still just as edible to me as before. And in fact, sometimes pest issues can increase the nutrition level in your plants as your plants respond to those pest issues. They create chemical compounds to respond to those pest issues, and a lot of those are actually plant nutrients for us. Okay, another piece of prevention, check regularly for insect damage. So if you find a little leaf miner on your plants and you find it when there's a tiny little bit of damage, it's much easier to control that damage than if you don't notice until that leaf is half eaten. And so we can regularly be inspecting our plants for insect damage. The other thing I want to remind you is that not all bugs are bad, and in fact, most of them are good. So just because you find a bug in your garden, don't just go crush it immediately. Do a little research on beneficial insects and some of the bugs that are in there, because a lot of them are actually working to control your pests for you. And so another thing we can do is remove the problem when we have bad bugs. So these are physical controls. So one of the easiest way to get rid of bugs, a lot of times we'll get a call on the grow line. They say, what can I spray to get rid of potato beetles? And we say, you don't need to spray anything. You just need to go out there with a cup of beer or water or something and go pick all the beetles off. Some of the potato beetles, we actually crush some with our fingers. It feels a little gross and cruel, but you'll get used to it. Sometimes the best way to control bugs in your garden is to just go in there and pick them off yourself. Another thing you can use is a strong stream of water and just actually blast your plants. So here's a charred plant that looks like it probably had pretty nasty leaf miners. And well, maybe not leaf miners. I can't even tell what's going on there. Something's eating the leaves. But sometimes a strong stream of water, aphids is a great example of something that you can just blast the aphids off with a pretty strong stream of water. Sometimes if I get a lot of them down by the soil, I'll scrape the top surface layer of the soil off and blast the bugs off that way. If you have areas where you're finding clusters of insects, you might see this in your chard where you get little brown spots in your chard. These are leaf miners. Sometimes I'll just prune out parts of the plants that have a ton of insect damage. I think it makes the plants look better, and it's good for my morale too. And you just don't want to ever prune out more than maybe like a quarter of the leaves at once. Some people like to get into hanging netting. I can't be bothered with things like this unless it's birds and my blueberries. But if you have this kind of ingenuity and desire to put forth effort, hanging netting over certain things can get rid of some flying pests. There's also something called floating row cover. You might have also heard the phrase remay before, the word remay. This is something you can use to keep out certain pests. It's really good for flea beetles. It can be good for, and even slugs. The thing you want to make sure is that you aren't using it to trap your pests in with your plants. So you need to really get remay on when it's really, your plants are really young before any pests are getting in there, because sometimes people use remay, they put it over, but they're just trapping flea beetles or whatever in there with their pests. This is something that costs money. It doesn't need to be done, but it also can help you if you have a really challenging pest problem. That's the other thing I would say is if you say, well, I always have really bad problems with flea beetles, and so I can't grow broccoli. Broccoli is an example of something flea beetles would eat. What should I do about that? And my answer would be, don't grow broccoli. And so it's kind of a simple solution, but sometimes there are certain things where we just have consistent pest problems, and sometimes we just will stop growing them. Or one form of crop rotation, for example, to break that pest cycle might be like, we're just going to stop growing broccoli this year, or for a couple years, or for 3 years to break that cycle. Yeah, there are certain things that can be controlled by shiny objects, like slugs and certain birds sometimes. But then the other piece that we're going to talk about is just keeping the ecosystem in balance. So these are these biological controls, inviting beneficial insects in, inviting in a strong flora, microflora in the soil, microfauna in the soil. And the key to this is it's all about diversity. So if you want to encourage, here's a cute little praying mantis. If you want to encourage beneficial insects in your garden, easiest way to do that is with more flowers and more diversity. The more diversity you have, the more different varieties of things you're going to find in the garden. Yes, maybe you find a little bit more pests, but you're also going to find way more beneficial insects, and you're going to have a better result overall. Okay, so before we get to the final questions, I'll just leave you with one last quote. You've all been so patient with us going on and on and on forever, so we knew this needed to be a 3-hour class. I'm sure you're all hungry and ready to go. But I just want to really give you all so much gratitude for being here with us. and just really invite you into this. I want to say this whole new era that we're in, where hopefully everybody's going to become a gardener. And I really love this quote from Audrey Hepburn: "To plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow." And I really hope that you can all use this new skill, this gardening, to keep you grounded and present in what's happening now, connected to each other, connected to the earth, and really allow that rooting to help you feel more safe and secure as we navigate this new brave new world. And so with that, I'm going to let those of you who want to go, you can go. You've been so patient. And those who want to stick around and ask questions, I will stick around and answer questions for the next half hour.
Okay, so I'm going to go through the questions that we've collected so far, and I've kind of grouped them into order. So first, I want to talk about mulch.
Okay.
So we had some questions about mulch. How much to mulch your garden, where to mulch your garden, and why to mulch your garden. So Jenny, do you want to go ahead with that?
Yes, mulch, mulch, mulch. Okay. So the answer is when to mulch your garden. I would say the second you've put plants in the ground, you want to mulch your garden. As soon as so the rule is no bare soil. So I never want to see bare soil in my garden. It's inevitable that you'll have brief moments when you have bare soil, but the second there's bare soil is when you're going to mulch. How much really depends on what kind of mulch you're using. You basically want it to be such that, imagine you're a tiny little seed and you land on top of that mulch. You want it to not be able to get down to the soil. But also sometimes we're using our mulch to enhance the nutrition of our soil. In that case, let's say you're using a mulch like leaves or compost or something, then I would say going anywhere from 2 to 6 inches deep. Some people would argue that 6 inches is way too much compost, and that might be true. Some of us has developed those habits. There's been a little bit of research out there showing that you don't actually get an advantage by adding more than 2 inches of compost at a time. I would challenge that a little bit. I've definitely seen differences in my garden when I've added more than 2 inches. So 2 inches is, I think, a good number. Did I answer that whole question, Mila?
In part. So we had some specific questions. So specifically about reducing watering. So yes, if you put down mulch and cover your soil, you're going to reduce the evaporation that happens. So you reduce your need to water. But then we had a counter question that's like, but wait, doesn't that promote fungal growth?
Okay, fungal growth. Yeah, so there's different, we could go into a whole launch about fungi, but there are many, many different kinds of fungi. So the fungal growth that will encourage is the fungi that tend to focus on decomposing rotting wood. So rotting wood is a very specific type of carbon. It's very different than the carbon that is produced in the roots of your plants. So I'm thinking this person is worried that those fungi are then going to go and try and eat her living plants. But the great news is that fungi have pretty specific roles in our environment. So the things that are going to go in and break down those create fungal networks in that wood, in those wood chips, they're not the same things that would break down our plants. And the great news about those fungal networks is that they actually will compete with the fungi that will break down our plants. So creating these fungal networks through decomposing wood in our garden is actually a real strong beneficial aspect of soil development in our garden. So it's only good.
And just to clarify, we were talking about mulch for that portion. I think you mentioned compost a couple of times, but really we meant how deep to mulch things. Yep. And some people do top dress with compost. It's a separate thing. Okay, so moving on to the other questions. We had more watering questions.
Okay.
They wanted to find out about using rain barrels and using the water collected off of your asphalt roof.
Yes. Okay. So this is a whole long topic, so I won't go into too much detail about it. But yes, there are things we do want to be cautious about water coming off of our roofs. And there are certain filters you can put on rain barrel water collection systems that make it possible to use water that can possibly be contaminated from your roof. I generally don't use water that's come off an asphalt roof, although there are people that do, because those shingles do have petroleum products in them. So a metal roof is definitely ideal, but there are filtration systems that you can use that can get a little bit more sophisticated. Certainly collecting rain, I do collect rainwater in my garden, and it's a wonderful asset to have. Yeah.
And if you're concerned about water from the asphalt roof, maybe save that water for your non-edibles.
Yep, that could be for your non-edibles. Yep, yeah, definitely. And I would, yeah, go ahead.
And then we had questions about seeds and about storing seeds year after year. What's the best way to store your seeds for next year?
Okay, so the best way to store your seeds is to have them in watertight, airtight containers. So we don't want any moisture to be able to get in there at all. And they would be ideal to be stored in a place that has relatively low, very low humidity. And ideal would be like anywhere from like 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So for a lot of us, you sometimes hear about people storing seeds in their refrigerator or freezer. This can be problematic because it's a humid environment in there. But it can be, so I store mine in, I have like little plastic Rubbermaid bins, and I keep them in my basement in a relatively cool spot. Sometimes people have drafty closets are a great place for them. You know, the garage is someplace people keep them, but often the temperatures get really low out there. Temperatures getting way too low around here is generally not an issue. It will decrease the longevity of your seeds if they're constantly getting frozen. But the worst thing for them is to be constantly hot. We don't want our seeds getting hot or moist. So anything where we can keep them in a cool place and store them year after year. And there are lots of charts at all the seed companies online that will let you know how long your seed will store. They're always giving you quotes for how long that seed would store in ideal conditions.
Okay, now we've got a couple of critter questions.
Okay.
So we had a couple of questions about ground bees. Are ground bees a problem in the garden?
I don't think it was a problem in the garden. No, I mean, unless you step on their nest, but they're not going to be problematic for, I'm thinking that the person is talking about for your plants.
Right.
And no, and in fact, a lot of our solitary bees and are pollinators, or there's also quite a few that are beneficial insects and will be predatory on other insects. So, you know, bees in general are all around good thing for the garden. So it's really more about, you know, personal safety there.
Okay, some talk specifically about dealing with snails and slugs.
Snails and slugs, yes. So snails and slugs are going to thrive in areas where you have really high moisture and humidity underneath your plants. So there's a couple things you can do. One product we sometimes use is called Sluggo. It's an organic product. It's made of copper sulfate, I think. And you can just sprinkle that around your garden and that will keep slugs out. Sort of the classic thing people like to do is put out a little shallow dish of beer. I don't know why, but maybe slugs really like beer and they will go in there, and then you empty that out and, you know, either feed them, if you have chickens, feed them to your chickens, or get rid of them and keep them away from your garden. Sometimes people will actually cut, for some reason, copper deters slugs. They will actually put copper, you can buy these copper strips you can put around your garden bed that will help keep slugs out. My favorite way to deal with slugs is to go out with a headlamp on or a flashlight late at night and pick the slugs off one by one with my hands as another good kid activity. And yeah, so those are the big ways that I deal with them.
Okay, other question about critters. Worms, are they good or not?
This is a long answer. This is like an age-old question. So earthworms are great for your soil. They will help break down organic matter and make it more available to your plants. However, in the Northeast where we're living, earthworms are not native to this land, so our soils have developed without them. There's also a new invasive pest called the jumping worm, and jumping worms are like really not good for your soil. There's still a lot of there's a lack of understanding about how jumping worms affect garden soil. For those who aren't familiar with jumping worms, we can also maybe Mila, we can send that around the fact sheet on jumping worms. But they basically wriggle like little snakes, which is why they're called jumping worms, and they're very prolific. They're known for eating organic matter at rates that it's almost impossible for nature to replenish fast enough. And so what you'll find is that with jumping worms, you can really have your soil texture change dramatically. But in general, worms in your soil are a great thing. Got another question for me, Mila?
So I think one last question that we had. Oh, two last questions that we had about critters. Chickens. So someone's got a chicken run. Is putting a garden near a chicken run going to be a problem? I guess maybe talking about manures or talking about a runoff from that.
Okay, sorry, we've talked so long, I have to plug in my computer. The chicken manure, nope, you won't have a problem at all with the runoff from that. The only thing is your chickens getting out will love to eat in your garden, but nope, there shouldn't be any problem putting your garden near chickens. And in fact, they, maybe some of the pests will get eaten by your chickens, which would be lovely.
And then the other answer, someone had a follow-up about the worms, any way to get rid of Asian jumping worms? And sadly, the answer is no.
Nope.
They're really prolific. They reproduce so fast, and we just have to kind of figure out how to live with them at this point.
Yep.
And try to prevent them from going somewhere else.
Yeah.
So if you already have them and your garden's already affected, there's really not much you can do about it. But the thing is, if you don't have them, do everything you can in your power to not get them. That means, some things that we used to do all the time is I used to go out and I used to get, fall leaves from neighbors and stuff, and get wood chips from the free pile that we have that our municipality puts out. I don't do that anymore, which is a bit of a challenge. Now I have to actually pay for material instead of getting those free things, but I'm going to be really careful about not spreading Asian worms into my garden. The more we can keep them out of our natural areas and into infecting more areas, the better. And then last but not least, we talked about, and this is a very regional question, we talked about how Brooktondale has some more acidic soils. Anything on West Hill about soils there?
Actually, I haven't lived on West Hill before, so I don't know off the top of my head. I'm guessing, I know that the soils on West Hill are rocky and they're not super high nutrition, but I don't know anything specific about any like weird pH issues or anything like that. And certainly not in the lead zone as much anymore.
Yeah.
But if you're curious about your soil, though, feel free to email our grow line at growline1@gmail.com. And one of our master gardeners will talk to you about your soil.
Yep. And so for everybody, we're going to be following up with emails that have links to all sorts of other resources, as well as that seed chart. And if you have any other questions, please follow up with questions to us at our email. Call the grow line, or email the grow line at growline1@gmail.com. And we hope you'll see you at our next class.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being so patient with us with all our technology and all this time. And we're really learning and growing about how long it takes to present all these things over the internet when we're not right in front of you. But we're just so incredibly grateful to have you all here and just really excited for you to become gardeners. So stay in touch, come take more classes with us. And yeah, thanks again for being here. We're just so happy to have you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.